Look, I mean, I think a really good question for listeners right now, or even you guys, is just, they're going to release this new iPhone. If you guys are Apple users, have you ever seriously considered switching to a different device?
No.
Or is it just the default now that I'm going to upgrade to the
Default.
iPhone 16, maybe a default? And so I think the question is, how long can that last, where it is just sort of the default? I mean, even their new features that are going to release today are all about, AI and how that ties into some of its hardware. But in all honesty, they're 2 years late to AI. A lot of the features Mark Gurman, our Apple colleague, is reporting that won't really release until 2025, at which point maybe you should just wait for the iPhone 17. And I just think there's a big question about, Apple's products are still good. They still make, the best laptop, the best, watch and earbuds. I'm talking through my AirPods right now. But at the same time, when they don't face that type of pressure, does their products just become too incremental and too boring? And I think that is when you're going to see a lot more disruptives trying to change the way computing works and work outside of the Apple ecosystem. But the problem for consumers like us is we're kind of stuck in it. I'm not going to switch anytime soon, for sure.
Well, then to that point, what I found also interesting, and I didn't know in the piece that you wrote, was sort of Tim Cook's role in managing Apple's supply chain. And you dug deep into Apple would have a supply chain partner and then in essence look to manufacture that in-house and then boot that company, which has really messed up tons of companies around the world. Can you give us some detail on that?
Sure. The most infamous example actually goes back about a decade ago. Apple was developing these new sapphire screens that were going to be ultra durable instead of the glass that they currently use. And they sort of outsourced it to a partner. And then left that partner on the hook with all the liability when Apple decided not to go that route because the Sapphire wasn't quite going as fast as they could develop it for the iPhone. And I think that we sort of position that as symbolic of what Apple has seen with a few of the partners they've worked with over the years, not just in the supply chain, but also on the software ecosystem side. It's really fascinating, all this sort of trend that we see of a partner really excited to work with Apple in the beginning, like Goldman Sachs on the Apple Card, or even General Motors, we cite as another example of working them on CarPlay. And then years go by, and suddenly they're not so happy with the relationship with Apple anymore. And I think that really has become a trend in recent years as the company has grown to this massive multi-trillion-dollar force that essentially it's Apple's way or the highway. And I'm just curious how long that will last with partners before they say, you know what, enough is enough.
And Austin, I think for a lot of investors, one of the longer term issues that's still always out there and is probably increasing in concern is just the regulatory risk for not just Apple, but kind of big tech in general, but certainly for Apple, given their marketing position. How do you think the companies how do they react to that? And just in terms of a long-term threat or headwind?
Well, actually, I mean, the DOJ case in the U.S., they just released their complaint in March. Apple has pushed to dismiss it just earlier in August. That's going to play out over the course of years. I think the preceding cases with the DOJ and IBM or DOJ and Microsoft, I mean, this lasts many, many years. But we're already seeing sort of a precursor to that in what's happening in Europe with the Digital Markets Act, which has already pushed Apple to change a ton. In fact, right now in Europe, because of those regulatory changes, you can get an alternative marketplace, meaning you don't just have to rely on Apple's App Store. You're actually able to delete in the US. You can delete Safari. You'll eventually be able to delete your phone app, your camera app, the App Store, and just use alternative products from the third-party ecosystem. And so what you're seeing in Europe is this almost two-track system where they have a lot more flexible sort of computing platform than anywhere else if you're an Apple user. So I think what they've sort of done is take this almost whack-a-mole approach to regulation in the EU, and even in some of the pressure they've seen in the US, they've had to open up that walled garden that as we refer to it, sort of their closed ecosystem a little bit more in a way that Apple doesn't like because they lose control. But for consumers, in a lot of ways, it's a little bit interesting to watch this company have to change and not just have it the Apple approach. They're going to have to, at least in Europe so far, open up their walled garden a little bit, allow some more players within their ecosystem to run some of those fundamental parts.
Yeah, which is why it's so interesting to read the piece, because it really reminds us that Apple wasn't the leader 40 years ago, that it was a very different world when it came to PCs. But you can definitely read this big take and more on the Bloomberg and at bloomberg.com/big take. Definitely check it out. Really wonderful stuff. Plus, if you're joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, like Austin is, if you're listening to us in Boston, our new home is now 92.9 FM in Boston. I could have done a little bit better, but I did it. All right, Austin, thanks a lot. Austin Carr, technology reporter for Bloomberg News. Remember that Apple event Glow Time starts at 10 a.m.
What's it called again?
Glow Time.
Glow Time.
Isn't
Okay.
that like a Bob Fosse song? Come on, Glow Time.
It could be.
Snapping. I see it. Apple stock is down by about 0.6%. It's usually a buy the rumor, sell the news kind of scenario, but the stock's been down by about 4%. It's been really choppy over the last few months for that Apple stock. All right, coming up, Brenna Casey is joining us, Bloomberg BNAV carbon capture analyst. Now, the activity in the carbon capture industry is now starting to slow, and I have to wonder what winds up happening, particularly in the U.S., if you get a new administration, and what that winds up meaning as well. Overall in the market, you're looking at losing a touch of steam. Not that much, a touch. S&P is up 0.8%. Happy Monday.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average now trading at the best level of the day, right to the numbers. The Dow up 518, up now by 1.3%. S&P advancing as well, off session highs, but still up 50. A gain right now of 0.9%. And the NASDAQ Composite Index is up 125 points for NASDAQ, an advance right now of 0.7%. 10-year 3.70% with a 2-year 3.66%. Gold down 30 cents the ounce to $24.97, just about flat on the day. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 0.5%. WTI now 68.04 a barrel. A renewed wave of dip buying spurred a rebound in stocks after a sell-off triggered by economic concerns. Traders now looking to this week's inflation data for clues about the size of Federal Reserve rate cuts. And with more on the CPI report on Wednesday, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Bloomberg Economics foresees the fourth straight month of tamer U.S. inflation, generally in line with the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Fed officials meet on interest rates next week, with Wall Street anticipating the first rate cut since the pandemic. There are hot spots such as housing costs. Research from the San Francisco Fed offers some hope, though. It's based on a pace of household creation and home building, and sees shelter costs returning to a less severe path in 2025. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
The discount retailer Big Lots has filed for bankruptcy protection and plans to sell the firm's assets and ongoing business in a court-supervised process. And B. Riley Financial, the embattled broker-dealer and investment firm, is out with preliminary plans to sell assets and round up financing to cope with its debt burden and shore up its balance sheet. B. Riley today advancing now by 10.2%. Again, recapping stocks higher. S&P is advancing by 1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thanks so much, Charlie Pellet. Alex Steele here alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business, economic, and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries all around the world. Every Monday at this time, we like to bring you another arm of Bloomberg, and that's Bloomberg NEF, originally or previously known as New Energy Finance, with a team in Bloomberg that tracks and analyzes the power to transport, to industry buildings, and ag sectors. And here with us for more is Brenna Casey, Bloomberg BNEF carbon capture analyst. Brenna, we take a look at, say, how carbon capture has grown, the amount of money that's been put in. So sorry. Paul has a question.
First, this is a pre-question. Can you define what carbon capture is?
It's probably the better question.
Yes, yeah. So basically, simply, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it's kind of just a way to abate emissions from heavy industry. So things like petrochemical refineries, integrated steel mills, hydrogen, blue hydrogen.
Okay.
Natural gas processing is a huge historical end-use sector.
So basically, there's some sectors that you cannot decarbonize, and they have to exist, like you need cement, for example. So this is a way to kind of get them out of the air, and then the question is kind of what do you do with it? Do you reuse it somewhere? Do you put it somewhere? Do you store it in a rock or somewhere else? And it's been a huge focus for a lot of companies, energy companies and alike, and oil companies, for example. What has been the investment cycle like, and where are we now in that cycle?
Yeah, so if we're looking particularly to the U.S., following the Inflation Reduction Act, we saw this catalysis of not only project announcements, but kind of, Series A, lots of equity financing into that, into the market. Right now, as, the IRS is still yet to address 45Q. So that's the Inflation Reduction. Yeah. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law, 2 years ago, 45Q is an investment tax credit that the government is proposing to, heavy emitters. They can, if they meet XYZ requirements, then they can take this credit and apply it to their tax burden, and kind of helps to mitigate the cost of CCS because it's extremely CapEx intensive.
So if you store your carbon or get it out of the air, you get a tax credit.
Okay.
It's like $85 per ton if you store it, and then $60 if you reutilize it. Yeah, exactly. However, the IRS has yet to finalize the criteria, so developers don't know what actually constitutes as a project that can qualify for these sorts of credits. And so what we've actually seen is not only investment taper off, but just announcements of future projects into the sector. What's kind of ironic is that if we look at investment numbers for last year for CCS in total, it was globally 11.3 billion, higher than it's ever been before. The U.S. took home around 2.8 billion of that. However, that is all bolstered by just DOE grants. So the DOE has these direct air capture hubs. They're trying to throw money at growing out midstream infrastructure, so transport pipelines, the storage basins you mentioned earlier. But there's really no FIDs being taken in the sector at all. Besides, I think it was the hydrogen Beaumont complex last year.
So FID is foreign investment decision, final investment decision,
yes.
Sorry. And it basically means okay, I have enough and I understand enough of the economics where I can actually put money in the ground and put a shovel in the ground and do some stuff. And that's where we're really lacking, which raises the question, is it building the stuff is still too complicated, or is it the demand side? So I'm a company and I'm I can capture your carbon and I can store it for you, but how much are you willing to pay for that? Is that part of the issue now?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a sector by sector issue. So if we look to power, we're seeing the most cancellations in the power sector just because CCS is tremendously expensive. And so if we're seeing a project announced, around 30% of those projects in the power sector are they're probably going to get canceled, and that's because retrofitting with CCS adds around 56% to the total LCOE. So it's 800 million plus investments. If you look to something
which also how do they recoup that? Because
exactly.
About power, it's either the company's paying for it or I'm paying for it in my bills, right? And that's a different way of how they recoup that cash.
Especially if the 45Q credit, if you are an emitter to qualify, it only lasts 12 years. A lot of these lifetimes are 20, 25 years, and so how do you kind of make that investment back?
Carbon capture losing some momentum because maybe just the transition to green in the U.S. has become a little politicized, and maybe it's losing a little bit of impetus. Are we falling behind other countries, for example?
The U.S. is definitely the market leader. So globally, there's around 424 million metric tons of CO2 capture capacity due to come online by 2035. Now, out of that, around 163 million tons is based in the U.S. And following, the 45Q, Inflation Reduction Act, even though there's, hiccups here, hiccups with transport and storage permitting, we do see the United States as the best place in the world to kind of build one of these projects.
So what companies do you feel have the real deal? Because I talk to a lot of companies and they're all going to try and sell me their carbon capture products and why they're the best and how their economics work and all that stuff. Who actually can make this work?
Yeah, if we're looking at power and hydrogen, which are the two leaders right now, kind of the biggest players here, we're seeing Occidental Energy. So not only are they looking to retrofit their, natural gas assets with carbon capture, but they're also kind of taking this first mover run into the direct air capture space. So that's a really interesting company to watch in that kind of little corner. There's also, air products for hydrogen. ExxonMobil, it's primarily these oil and gas majors that are moving around in the market because they have, just previous expertise, but they also understand the geology, how to store these things, how to build, these big, expensive projects. Air products, Oxy.
So Oxy is one of the pure players for E&Ps, for oil and gas, but you talk to the CEO, and she wants to eventually basically be a rent for hire direct air capture. So meaning hey, I need you to capture some stuff, and you build a plant near a factory or somewhere else, and you just suck carbon out of the air, and then therefore you're able to separate it and then store it somewhere or reuse it. And that's what they want that business model to be. Amazon signed an offtake with them. They wouldn't tell me the price. They're it was really hard. You can get the offtakes and the buyers an Amazon, but it is really expensive yet. It hasn't become easy on that sense. All right, Brenna, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Brenna Casey, Bloomberg BNEF carbon capture analyst. I obviously find this really interesting.
I know, I did too. That's why I love it. It's good stuff.
And the idea is you can do green all you want, but we're not starting over from scratch. So you actually need carbon capture to get the existing emissions out, because how else do you filter that? You can get trees, and that's awesome. We want trees, right? Maybe the ocean, but we need all the things to make all of this work.
I'm learning.
All right, coming up, we have more from our Big Take podcast this time. Not the Big Take story, but Big Take podcast. David Gura, correspondent for Bloomberg and host of the Big Take podcast, discussing Tuesday's presidential debate. Plus, he had a recent conversation with Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary. We're going to break that down with him coming up next. This is Bloomberg Intelligence.
is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, over the weekend, Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, spoke with Bloomberg News' David Gura. He's a busy guy. That was during a fireside chat on the sidelines of the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin, Texas. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen reiterated her view that the U.S. economy has reached a soft landing even as the job growth weakens.
Overall, I would say for the U.S., the kinds of metrics that we would monitor that would summarize risks, whether it's asset valuations or the degree of leverage, things look good. There are not, I don't see red lights flashing.
Joining us now is David Gura, correspondent for Bloomberg and host of the Big Take podcast. What else did you glean from the conversation with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen?
Well, as you said, it was wide-ranging. I had an hour with her, and that's a significant amount of time. And, you know, she does TV interviews from time to time, but very few things of that length. And we're at this point where I think that she's quite willing to look back on a very long and distinguished career in public service. So we touched upon a lot of that, her work at the Fed, her work as an advisor to President Clinton as well. But the big things that we talked about were the economy today, whether or not there's going to be a soft landing as she sees it, how the labor market looks in light of the jobs numbers that we saw on Friday, and also just about the work that she's done as Treasury Secretary overseas. She put together this deal with so many countries related to corporate taxes. She marshaled allies together after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to fight back against that with sanctions. And she's emerged as, I think it's safe to say, the strongest conduit of communication with China that the U.S. has today. I mean, we had that moment when Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went over there, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, went, and Janet Yellen went. And I think it's very clear she had the most receptive audience, even though she was delivering difficult news about overcapacity and all these things that really irk the United States and companies here. Folks, and we talked a lot about this, she and I, folks there listened to her, welcomed her, and even though it was tough medicine, they were willing to kind of sit there and hear what she had to say.
Is she overall constructive on our relationship with China, or did it come across that she shares maybe a deeper concern?
She was very frank about the state of that relationship that she inherited. She said that it had frayed, and so a lot of her work in those early months was to kind of knit back together this relationship and, again, to try to establish these levels of communication. But I asked her explicitly, I said, look, there are people in your party, in the White House even, who say that there should be much less engagement in light of who China is and what China is doing at this point. But she's of the belief that, yes, see them as rivals, see them as our chief competitor, but you have to be able to talk to China. You have to be able to air your grievances, hear what they have to say, have constructive conversations. If you don't have that, there could be grave risks both to the economy and to national security. So she is an advocate for more constructive communication than less.
Which sets us up to the train you're taking in the next couple hours, right?
Yes.
You're going to be going to the first presidential debate, maybe the only, we don't know. And obviously for our audiences, taxes and tariffs are going to be those two that actually maybe sovereign wealth funds that are going to be really high up on the list. What do you think the investment community is most concerned about?
All of those things, I'm curious how much of that comes up. And there's been this kind of chorus of criticism, I think, of both candidates in recent weeks. You know, what are the specific policies that you have or don't have? And we saw Donald Trump last week in New York speaking before the Economic Club, ostensibly to to talk about some of those policy priorities in some detail. And I think there's a lot of criticism that there wasn't much there. And the same thing has been levied at Kamala Harris, you know, Vice President. What do you believe in? What do you want to see happen? What are those concrete policies? Now, I've been covering this long enough to know that a debate often doesn't feature a lot of concrete policy proposals. So we'll see what, if anything, there comes up. I think mostly what the investment community wants to see is what a lot of people watching this debate want to see, which is how do these two candidates interact with one another? What does Kamala Harris talk about? How does she comport herself on that stage? I look at the polling that we got over the course of the weekend from the New York Times and Siena College, and people know Donald Trump. They know how he behaves and what he stands for by and large. That's not true of Kamala Harris. And so it's incumbent on her to use this moment, as you say, the only debate that's on the calendar right now, to just introduce herself to a lot of Americans who may know who she is but don't know what animates her and what her kind of guiding principles are, what the policies are that she'd like to see put in place.
Well, she's been preparing for several days now in Pittsburgh, so presumably she'll be prepared on the facts, and I think the expectation is, based on some of her past debating, that she's a solid debater. Do you believe she engages with Donald Trump at a Donald Trump level, or does she try to stay to policy and maybe her speaking points?
It's interesting what she does and doesn't talk about. And I go back to that CNN interview, the only one that she's done since she's been named the nominee. And there were moments in it when Dana Bash tried to get her to talk about being a woman going against Donald Trump, being a woman of color going against Donald Trump, and she didn't want to talk about that. So I think that we're seeing her take a different kind of lane. You go back and look at what Hillary Clinton did when she was running against Donald Trump in 2016. She did talk about misogyny. She did talk about things that Donald Trump had said beyond the realm of policy. I think that Kamala Harris is studiously avoiding that, and we're likely to see that in that debate tomorrow night. I do think that she, as you say, over the course of these 5 days, has been doing mock debates. Philippe Brynas, who used to play Donald Trump in the Hillary Clinton mock debates, is going to be playing Trump again. She'll be looking for ways to, I think, get his guard down, irritate him, kind of get a response out of him. Of course, the big unsettled thing for many days was, will the mics be muted or not when one candidate is speaking? They will be. So that does kind of limit her opportunity to get him to kind of jump in and say something that could be a viral moment or a memeable moment in the way that we saw back in 2016.
I remember we talked about how, the debates matter. Yeah, they did. Yeah. I mean, it was after President Biden was on the debate. Like, it clearly did matter. All right, David, thanks a lot. Super appreciate it. David Gura joining us, Bloomberg correspondent and a host of the Big Take podcast. And on Tuesday, Bloomberg Television and Radio will have special coverage of this ABC News debate in a global simulcast starting at 8 p.m. Wall Street time. Definitely don't want to miss that. So your bedtime's what, 9 p.m.?
Yeah, this isn't happening.
So you're not gonna see it.
No,
you'll get the highlights the next day.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how it works. I mean, you start these things at 9 o'clock. Come on.
I mean, we gotta go to bed. I mean, I hear you. Like, I'm 10 at the latest. Anyway, it's gonna be interesting to see. I feel like markets are just ignoring. I think it's after someone's elected that then the markets will start actually paying attention.
Yeah, I think, what we've heard from a lot of the experts is, the closer we get, the more the markets will pay attention to it. So.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that taxes, that were still really the question.
Taxes.
All right, and control of Congress, too. All right, that wraps it up for Bloomberg Intelligence on this Monday. Coming up next, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew, S&P up 1%.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
57 days to the election, just one day to the big debate. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the candidates hunker down ahead of what could be their only face-off in this race. Just as Congress returns to D.C. from the summer recess, they are back. This hour, we're joined by Bloomberg's Dan Flatley as Republicans in the House release a scathing report on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. We'll take a look inside. We'll talk with former RNC Communications Director Lisa Camuso-Miller, a veteran of the House Speaker's office, on the spending fight that's about to begin in Washington. And we'll spend time with Bob McNally at Rapidan Energy on oil and the election. Our signature panel is with us, Rick Davis and Gidi Shanzano. And we start, as always, on Wall Street. A look at the markets right now with Charlie Pellet in New York. Charlie, what do you have?
All right now, Joe Matthew, we got a lot of green on the screen. Back to work Monday. What a week it was last week. A brutal week for the U.S. equity market. Today, starting out on a positive note. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all moving higher. S&P right now climbing by 1%, up 57 points for the S&P 500 index. That is a gain of 1.1%. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average up now by 531 points for the Dow, a gain now of 1.3%. NASDAQ up 162 for NASDAQ, higher by just about 1%. 10-year yield 3.70% with a 2-year that's yielding 3.66%. Spot gold right now up 0.1%, little change, $24.99 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil is climbing 1%, $68.36 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. Dip buyers emerging after last week's sell-off. What about the politics of Federal Reserve rate cuts ahead of the election? That question this morning for Neil Dutta, the head of U.S. Economic Research at Renaissance Macro Research.
If they didn't go 50 and they only go 25, and that potentially fuels bets that the Fed will be behind the curve later, and then we're talking about even larger moves after the election, how would that not be political? I mean, to me, they have full clearance to go 50 as it is. And I do find this sort of argument, well, if they go 50 to start, it would be a panic. That would be a panic move. Well, by that logic, maybe they shouldn't go at all.
Neil Dunham of Renaissance Macro. Apple's iPhone 16 line will be the focus of its product launch event today, coming up in California. But also its slumping wearable device business is also poised to get a boost as well. Ahead of those announcements, we've got Apple shares down by 0.2%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P now up 61, a gain of 1.1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. What would we do without Charlie? Welcome to Monday, the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and you'll see our live feed right there. The cameras are lit in the studios every day, whether it's Washington or New York, and we invite you for a great conversation here, in our case about politics, but of course intersecting with the economy and the markets. The 9th day of the 9th month, and that means we have 57 days to the election. We are now on fast forward. Remember, we talked about the sprint coming out of Labor Day? Here it is, with the candidates hunkered down today ahead of the big debate tomorrow night. If you haven't heard me say this, special coverage here on Bloomberg. Tomorrow night starts 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Myself, Kaylee Lyons, Rick and Jeannie will be with us, and we'll go through it all together with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, their first and maybe only debate of the cycle. In fact, they have never met before. And it's going to be interesting to see what we get here. She's in Pittsburgh still for debate prep, where she's been since Thursday, and will travel to Philadelphia, we're told, late afternoon. So she wakes up in the city tomorrow, where the fight will be had. Of course, Donald Trump preparing in his own way as Congress returns to Washington. You can feel it in the air. This will be the last less than or sub-hour-long commute I figure I'll have to work today for a minute. After 6 weeks of summer recess, I think that's more than my kid got from school. Lawmakers coming back today, and they have to figure out how to fund the government. We're going to talk a lot more about this coming up. Big Rules Committee meeting tonight will give us a sense of whether this sees the light of day. By the way, it probably won't. Now, one of the other big events happening on Capitol Hill and today in Washington as lawmakers return is the release of this investigative report on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is coming from the Republican-led House, and it brings us to the story here on the terminal. Dan Flatley, Tony Capaccio sharing the byline. Republicans accuse Biden team of lying about Afghanistan pullout. Dan Flatley is with us right now from Bloomberg's national security team. It's good to see you, Dan. You saw this report coming. Did we learn anything new?
We didn't learn a whole heck of a lot new. I mean, this withdrawal has been litigated, reported on for the last 3 years since it actually happened. But what we did see is basically a portrait painted by the House GOP under, or the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Michael McCall of Texas, of an administration that was just sort of so concerned about the public perceptions of how all this was going down that they really hid information from the public, and they tried to make it appear as though everything was proceeding as normal until it wasn't. So the administration has commented on this in the past. There was a State Department report separate from the administration comment that did find fault with both Trump and Biden administrations on this. But what we see now is a little bit more detail in terms of the timeline, who knew what, when they knew it, and how that was all communicated to the public.
This seems to be in part about focusing or even refocusing blame with more than 230 references to the Biden-Harris administration. They do not draw any lines directly to Kamala Harris, which I find no evidence that she was directly involved in planning or executing the plan. Gregory Meeks, the ranking member on that committee, calls this a partisan report. So we should qualify this, I guess, as a Republican product. Is that?
So the interviews that were conducted that formed the basis for this report were both parties were present. So there was somebody from the Republican, staff there, somebody from the Democratic staff there. But the report itself was the product basically of the GOP-led staff. And it wasn't shown in its entirety to the Democrats until the report was released publicly sometime last night, today. So obviously Meeks has his point of view. He feels that this was a partisan effort to tie this to the Biden-Harris, particularly administration. And the House GOP folks say that they're just following the administration's own messaging, that the administration is now really referring to itself as the Biden-Harris administration.
Sure.
And so they're just following
that is
suit
what it
with
is.
that. So, you know, obviously we have the debate coming up tomorrow. Trump has ramped up his criticism of the Biden administration for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's a much longer, more complicated story to tell about all of this.
Does it tell the story of the Trump administration's role in this? Obviously, they were executing a plan that Donald Trump cut with the Taliban and, in fact, delayed things. In retrospect, does the Republican take suggest that they should have followed Trump's plan to the letter?
So there is, obviously you're referring to the what's called the Doha Agreement, which was reached between basically the U.S. and the Taliban in terms of a withdrawal. And there was some recommendation at some point, and this came out in some testimony after the withdrawal itself, that the military had recommended about 2,500 U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan. And so obviously we have a bit of a disagreement in terms of, well, Trump says, well, we had the deal and we were executing it according to the terms of that agreement. The Biden administration has said we were just following what the Trump administration had laid out. But there was some dissension both within the military and potentially, as we've seen, unclear exactly who was talking about this within the State Department about we may need to for this to proceed even more slowly because of some of the security situation on the ground. Where this gets a little bit more complicated is, well, how long could the U.S. have stayed in Afghanistan? I mean, we were there for 20 years. Were we prepared to stay another 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years or even longer? You know, you talk to Republicans on the Hill. Some folks feel that we should have stayed basically indefinitely, that we could have maintained a small security presence there for a long time. Others feel differently. But I think one of the things that this report emphasizes is that President Joe Biden really felt that it was necessary to get out and to get out quickly.
Well, this is a really important conversation. It's not something you can fit on a bumper sticker. It's not that headlineable, even though you will hear headlines about this constantly. We wanted to dig into the matter a bit, remembering, of course, that on this program, retired General Ken McKenzie, who was CENTCOM commander at the time, says both administrations deserve blame for those 13 deaths. Dan, it's great to have you back. Thank you for putting the time into reporting on this. Dan Flatley from our national security team here at Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with a lot more to talk about here as lawmakers get back to town. Lisa Camuso-Miller spent enough years in the Speaker's office to know just what the mood must be like on Capitol Hill with all the jets coming in, lawmakers showing up, becoming reunited with the staff. They've been gone 6 weeks, and you know there's a clock ticking already on a potential government shutdown. We run out of money on September 30. And by the way, no one's saying that we're going to shut down. The countdown clocks are not up yet. But we don't have a lot of time to figure this out, just 3 weeks. Lisa, of course, back with us, Republican strategist and also host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Lisa, great to see you. Did you used to get the back-to-school jitters coming off the summer recess when everybody's coming back into the house?
You know, Joe, the one thing about summer recess is that it's kind of a mirage in Washington. Like, we all talk about it as if members are coming back, but they really are busy at home. I mean, they do call it a district work period for a reason. So the staff, while it's a little bit lighter, they're still on the ground. And so the one thing that gets lost on them coming back is that they're not coming back to work refreshed. In fact, if anything, they're coming back with like this voice from the district about what people are really caring about. And so they're energized in a way that's a little bit different. But yes, there is a bit of a back to school feel for certain.
Well, Tom Massey says no. That's the first high-profile no we've got here on the Rules Committee. Lisa, I'm talking about funding the government here. And obviously, there are a lot of conservatives who don't like the idea of a stopgap. The Speaker says he wants to do 6 months, and he has attached the SAVE Act, which is a poison pill for Democrats. What are we going to do here? I feel like we've seen this movie a lot of times, Lisa. We've watched it with you. We've popped the corn together. Does it have the same ending on the 30th?
Well, Joe, here's the thing. The one thing that's different this time around is that you said it at the top of the show, 57 days till election day, right? And so nobody, not a Republican, not a Democrat, wants to go home and have to defend why they closed the government, right? So that's the big motivator here. So yes, the SAFE Act is definitely something that's going to be very, very difficult. That's the one piece here that's going to cause this to be difficult. I expect that it will get out of rules, this package. For those people who are following along, that means that the bill will get a vote. But I think a lot of people are still there. The Senate is upset about that. And there's a lot of people, even moderates in the Republican side, that are upset about the fact that we're not going to address concerns about issues like telehealth and other things that make access to healthcare easier for people. And so that's the one thing that if we don't get this right, and if we don't figure out how to thread the needle, and by we, I mean the U.S. government and the Congress themselves, then they're going to have to answer for that at home and in the ballots, right? And in the election results. And so this, to me, is the kind of day where everyone is very busy. The speaker is trying to deliver on. Don't forget, Joe, it wasn't that long ago that the House Republicans had this whole big switch up where they put somebody else in the job. And so if you're the new speaker, and it's not really that new, but if you're him, you want to be able to deliver on something to show that we can govern, that the Republican Party and the House Republicans can govern. And that way they can go home to their district and they can show that they can be successful and show that they are worthy of being returned not only to a majority, but a bigger majority so that they can do more.
Okay, so let's think about the way this will go in the next couple of weeks, Lisa, knowing, of course, yes, lawmakers want to get home to campaign. This is it. The window's closing. So let's close our eyes a little bit here and think about the next couple. I'm closing my eyes on YouTube. They get this done somehow, according to what you're saying, Lisa. Maybe they find a way to get this out of rules. They get a vote. It passes the House with this SAFE Act. This is the bill that requires proof of citizenship to register to vote. All right, sorry, I have to close my eyes again. It goes to the Senate. They hate that. They take that out. They vote on it without the SAFE Act. It comes back to the House. And then we spend a week banging our heads against the wall, knowing all the time that it will actually end up passing so they can go home. So what form does it take? Is it a 6-month stopgap by the time this is done?
Well, the good thing about the 6-month stopgap is that it gives whatever administration is coming into office an opportunity to put this is a productive plan, but it's never been done before, right? This large of a stopgap has never been done before in a continuing resolution. And so people are going to hate it, people being Republicans and Democrats in the Congress. So it feels to me like, Joe, that could be where we have some wiggle room and where we have some room to move there as it relates to SAFE, and then it relates to the CR, the long 6-month holdover. I guess we'll have to wait and see, but it feels like there are some pieces that can be pulled, some threads that can be pulled that potentially could get us to a place where we get the government funded and we get through to the end of the year at the very least.
Producer CC warns, if you're listening in the car, please do not close your eyes. I didn't mean to do that to you. Lisa, enter the Gold Star families. We've been talking about Afghanistan, and I find this timing really interesting here because tomorrow, now that this Afghanistan withdrawal report is out, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries will attend a congressional gold medal ceremony honoring the 13 service members who died. The speaker invited them, and these will be the most senior Democratic officials to be with these families since Joe Biden attended the dignified transfer shortly after their deaths. These are going to be very difficult optics. It comes after this very difficult view on things in the committee's report today. To what extent is the House majority investing itself in this presidential campaign to cast blame on Joe Biden, on Kamala Harris, or is there something else at hand?
Well, it does feel that way, Joe, and that I think is very unfortunate. It's two different, talking out of two sides of our mouth, right? We've got this investigation that's happening. The families of these lost, they really, at this point, they blame everybody. They blame all of the U.S. government for how this happened and how they lost their loved ones. And so setting aside the politics of all of this, we really need to also honor those who kept us safe, who did what they were there to do in a way that is so incredibly honorable and appreciated in beyond politics. Set all of that aside. never mind the fact that, Joe, don't forget that this is also the anniversary of 9/11, which is one of the largest catalysts for us being there in the first place, right? So there's so many different threads, so many different things that are happening this week that I think it's incredibly important and incredibly honorable that Republicans and Democrats can come together to honor those who do keep us safe here at home in the U.S., regardless of who we blame for the political fallout of this. I also think, too, Joe, that as much as this is important, that this is not the issue that is driving people to the polls in 57
Well, this
days.
is, though, why we have Lisa Camuso-Miller join us here on Bloomberg Radio. Lisa, thank you for a perfect answer on that. We're going to have a lot more ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks continue to power higher. S&P 500 index just about the best level of the day right now. We're looking at a 64-point gain, up 1.2%. After last week's rout, the Dow is higher, up now by almost 600 points, up by 1.5%, while NASDAQ is up 185 points. For NASDAQ, a gain of 1.1%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares also taking part in the rally, up right now by 1%. Dow Transport's up by 1.3%. 10-year yield at 3.70% with a 2-year that's now yielding 3.67%. Spot gold up $4.50 the ounce, 25.01. A gain for gold of 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil is also advancing today, up now by just about 1.1%. WTI 68.45 a barrel. Boeing shares are rallying on optimism that a labor deal with its largest union will help the troubled aircraft manufacturer avoid a potentially crippling strike at its Seattle area factories. The two sides say the landmark offer includes a 25% wage increase over 4 years and a commitment to build Boeing's next plane in the Seattle area. Boeing shares right now, they're up by 5.7%. First day officially on the new job for Starbucks. A new CEO, Brian Niccol. He used to run Chipotle Mexican Grill. He spent the last few weeks visiting dozens of the company's coffee shops. Expectations are high. The company soared 18% after it named Niccol as CEO after 2 consecutive quarters of sales slumps. But now Niccol faces problems that range from lengthy order times in stores and also failing demand to union, along with union contract negotiations and pressure from activist investors. And the discount retailer Big Lots made it official today, filing for bankruptcy protection. It plans to sell the firm's assets amid ongoing business as an ongoing business amid a court-supervised process. So again, recapping here, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. S&P up 6, a gain of just about 1.2%. 10-year yield, 3.71%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet. Great to have Charlie with us here and his eyes on the markets every day on Balance of Power. Welcome to Monday. Did you have a good weekend? I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. It's good to see you here on Bloomberg Radio. On YouTube, you can always dial us up on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. It's like the best thing going, you know. This is all yours. You can watch, listen all day long, back it up, move it forward. And of course, we welcome our global television audience in hour 2. Barack Ravid with breaking news. He's reporting for Axios on the potential for a ceasefire in Israel. This is not something that we expected to talk about, but the president convening his national security team today to talk about the deadlock. We have been asking repeatedly, what's the sticking point here? What's taking so long? Is it this argument over the Philadelphia corridor, or is there more to it? And Axios is reporting by way of Barack Ravid that Biden's advisors spoke today with senior officials in Qatar and Egypt. All right. They made it clear to them that Hamas's excessive demand regarding the number of prisoners that the group wants to be released, which go beyond previous agreements between the parties, is the reason for the stagnation in the talks. That's more specific information than I have heard in days, and wanted to bring that to you as it's something that we've been following awfully closely around here. I mentioned the weekend. I do hope you had a good one. As we get back to reality a bit here in Washington this week, we've got the debate tomorrow, but lawmakers are back today. And like you, I'm driving around Sunday, thought I'd tank up the car, and I thought, my gosh, look at that. Less than $3 a gallon? I haven't been paying close enough attention, I guess. I didn't realize that had come to the Washington area. So we take a look at AAA here. What do they have? The national average, $3.27. With the story on the terminal, falling pump prices blunt Trump's inflation attacks on Harris. Now, of course, we're going to get a lot of talk about inflation and the economy at this debate tomorrow night. It's issue number 1. And what's the most common price that you see when you're, not like me, paying attention? You know who's quoted in this column is our good friend Bob McNally at Rapidan Energy Group, who says the drop may provide Harris with a bump here among voters who are not shy about blaming the White House for high gas prices. Of course, I don't know that Kamala Harris had anything to do with them going up or if she has anything to do with them coming down right now. But Bob is with us right now, I'm happy to say, from, as I mentioned, Rapidan Energy Group, where he's founder and president. It's great to see you, Bob. Is this just a case of good luck for the Democratic ticket?
Hey, Joe. You know, it is. When you're going into a tough election and you're the incumbent, you want to have gasoline prices at least off the radar screen. You know, I think there are 2 modes for gasoline prices in our country. Ignorance, like who cares? and then panic and terror and anger, and they don't want that. And that's where we were 2 years ago when we had record high pump prices, the average of $5 a gallon after Russia invaded Ukraine. So that's kind of a fresh memory. But yeah, at 328, 327, as you said, and falling, it's a bit of a tailwind. It's sort of off the discussion plate right now, and that's helpful for Vice President Harris.
Well, we'll throw another number in there. Right now, it's 68.67. That's a barrel of crude, West Texas Intermediate. Bob, the reason, and you can speak to this much more eloquently than I as a world-class analyst, but is this not reflecting the expectation for lower demand and an economic slowdown? And this is a blessing until it's a curse, right?
It certainly is. You know, there are bad reasons for pump prices to go down. You don't want to see lower oil prices that reflect weakening demand, weakening economic activity, Joe, as you mentioned. And the main concern here is China, the big importer, the growing, eventually will be the biggest consumer. And China's in, I mean, Bloomberg's reporting, whether it's deflation, slowdown in growth, it's pretty awful. And now they are stockpiling. They're sucking in a lot of crude and putting it into storage for their SPR. That's helping a little bit. But China's slowing, economic activity is weak, therefore demand is down. That's why some of those OPEC Plus members had to postpone their plans to gradually increase production starting next month. So the world is adjusting to a weaker economic environment. And that's why oil prices are falling, but that's not the reason you want oil prices to fall.
Boy, isn't that right? As we spend time with Bob McNally, who before his time here in the oil sector and running his own company was in fact an energy advisor at the White House in the George W. Bush administration. Politics are huge, Bob, right now. That's why we're talking about this. And I wonder what you're going to be listening for in this debate tomorrow night. And when you squint your eyes a little bit and you look at the plans that have been put forth here from both sides, I know that they are lacking details when it comes to energy. Donald Trump says, drill, baby, drill, and it'll be the centerpiece of his fight against inflation. We get slightly different comments from Kamala Harris, who spent more time talking about her previous comments about fracking, I think, than anything else. But, you know, it's part of my job to remind everybody that we're pumping a record amount now. So give us the 30,000-foot view on what a Harris administration versus a Trump administration, what they would both bring, or what they would both mean to this industry.
Well, Joe, I think the most important implication for oil markets of either a Trump or a Harris victory has to do with Iran, actually. Iran sanctions. I think President Trump has promised to reimpose maximum pressure to try to cut off those Iranian oil exports, which have crept up quite high now, around 1.5 million barrels a day. That would make crude and pump prices go higher, all else equal. Okay. Conversely, Kamala Harris, I understand, is her team wants to do a deal with Iran, another nuclear deal. And for that, she might be willing to issue waivers, allowing Iran to sell more oil in an already oversupplied market. The crude price would go down with pump prices. So I hope they get pressed on their respective plans for Iran, because in terms of what's going to affect the pump price for you, me, and our neighbors in the next few months and weeks, I think it has to do with Iran. More broadly speaking, President Trump said he's going to get pump prices below where they were in his first term. That's like about $1.60 a gallon. Without crashing the economy, how do you do that? It's tough. You can't unleash enough production, in my view, to do that alone. And Kamala Harris hasn't taken off the table lifting the filibuster to pass the Green New Deal. She did flip on fracking, but she's in favor of lifting the filibuster for the Green New Deal. Hope she'll be asked about that. So both candidates, I hope they get some tough questions.
Based on what you said about Iran, this is fascinating and really interesting to our viewers and listeners here, Bob. Is there enough potential capacity here domestically that Donald Trump could, in fact, reimpose pressure on Iranian oil, but make up for it here in the U.S. so prices do not rise? Or is that just not possible? You get one or the other.
Impossible, Joe. No, impossible. Shale oil production is not what we call spare production capacity. President Biden learned this the tough way in 2021. You just don't go to Exxon or old Pioneer back in the day and say, go into the basement and turn on more shale. It doesn't work that. We're producing all out, and our production is slowing. No, the only replacement for those Iranian barrels is in Saudi Arabia and UAE. And they may be reluctant to increase production until they see those Iranian barrels go off, if it's the case of President Trump. So, no, the only offset is really in the Middle East. They have what we call spare production capacity, quickly producible crude, not the U.S. We're operating at full tilt.
Boy, this is a seminar with Bob McNally. Pretty remarkable here. Bob, talk to us about natural gas then. This LNG moratorium that we have, the export moratorium, has been criticized heavily by Republicans. Should we assume that a Harris administration would continue it? What would happen if it was a Trump 2.0?
Joe, I think you put your finger on perhaps the most important implication of Kamala Harris succeeding Joe Biden as head of the ticket. While she will probably, if elected, allow permitting to resume, I would expect it would be with much tougher conditions, environmental justice, carbon abatement, etc. Let's just step back. We saw after the COP, after almost a year ago, the environmental community has come back and said, we want one thing from the federal government: no more LNG permitting, period. Calcasieu Pass and everything else. And so while they're being quiet now because they want Kamala Harris to get elected, if she wins, they will go to her early next year and say, we want just one thing: don't allow a return to sort of rubber-stamped LNG permitting. And I think a Kamala Harris will be more receptive than Joe Biden would be to that argument. So it'll be a little tougher for those projects.
Reminding us that we just don't know, right, Bob? This is why this debate is important. I don't know if they're going to drill down on detail like that, but these policy proposals are incredibly important for the market to get its head around, and we're left wanting in many cases. I've got less than a minute here, Bob. You'll watch that in real time, right? Because you're the voice, one of the many voices I'll have in my head while we're doing our coverage here.
You bet. The debate tomorrow night, you bet, absolutely.
Yeah.
And hope we get detailed, tough questions, because there hasn't been a lot of specifics on either side. Good to get some detailed questions.
On either side. This is a former White House energy advisor, hungry for information. Bob, I'm really happy you could talk to us today. Thank you for joining, as always. Bob McNally, founder, president, Rapidan Energy, former White House energy advisor in the W. Bush administration, author of the book Crude Volatility, which is not about politics. Our signature panel is up next. Off the weekend, Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano for the rest of the program. Their take on the news we're having now, Congress back to town, and the debate tomorrow night. They'll be with us in our special coverage right here on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We got ourselves a major rally underway on this back-to-work Monday with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all surging. A 1.3% gain right now on the S&P after last week's sell-off. S&P up 69 points now and back at 54.77. Dow Industrials up 626 points for the Dow. A gain right now of 1.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 192 points for NASDAQ. An advance right now of 1.1%. 10-year, 3.70%. The 2-year, 3.66%. Gold at $25.02 the ounce. Little changed, up by about 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil, just talking about the price of gasoline and crude WTI, $68.73 a barrel. WTI up now by about 1.6%. And Bitcoin, 56,196 Bitcoin today, up by 3.3%. Millions of Americans are falling behind on student loan payments, and their credit scores are moving closer to the chopping block. Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice explains.
About 10 million people with U.S. student loans fell behind on payments as of the end of January, and many were more than 3 months late. For now, they're shielded because of a White House-ordered moratorium. However, the moratorium ends next month, and a large share of the borrowers will likely be classified as seriously delinquent. The report was issued by the Government Accountability Office, an independent agency that compiles research for Congress. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
GSK's experimental drug helped prevent serious asthma attacks in 2 late-stage studies, easing the path forward for a medicine that the British company says could reach $3.9 billion in annual sales. ADRs of GSK, they're up today by 0.7%. Among the names today reporting after the close of trading, we'll be hearing from Oracle. Oracle shares up by 0.8%. Recapping a Monday rally underway with the S&P now higher by 72 points, up 1.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Now back we go to Washington. And once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Thank you, Charlie Pellet, as ever, watching the markets for us, and that'll be the case for our second hour, too. As we're just getting started here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where we always invite you to join us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. You'll find our live stream. Come on in. The water's warm. Because nothing that we can tell you about today, we've got a lot to talk about. Congress coming back into town. We've got a Real Rules Committee meeting that might give us a sense of this budget fight that we're in for. The candidates are hunkered down, working on their debate prep. But nothing today matters, right? With the debate tomorrow, it's the only thing that matters. That's why, of course, they're both off the grid today, preparing, each in their own way, but remembering the impact the last debate had. Because we spent a whole primary cycle. I'd come on here every day. Did it move the needle, was the first question. And the answer was always, no. This is a country that's locked in place. The division is so close. They're fighting over so few voters that no, the debate may not change a thing until the first general election debate, of course, blew the entire race open and turned it upside down. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, political science professor, Iona University, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor and partner at Stone Court Capital. Great to see you both. Of course, Rick and Jeannie will both be with us for our special coverage when things will matter a lot tomorrow night. And Jeannie, I'd like to start with you on this and just how you see it. We got a New York Times Siena poll out over the weekend, says this is a 1-point race right now, Donald Trump in a statistical tie with Kamala Harris. So could the debate break this open?
It absolutely could. I mean, you know, in my mind, and I've long said this really race has not changed. It has been tight all along. She does have more enthusiasm. She did open those swing states a little more in the Sun Belt than Joe Biden had been able to do. But by and large, on the national level, this has been a margin of error race from start. And now we're, 57 days out. But that means the debate can matter because, to your point, there are so few people who haven't decided who they're going to vote for. Even a small change there, a small slip up by either one of these candidates can have a real impact. So we saw the debate mattered a lot last time. I think this one matters even a bit more because any one of these things that can happen in this debate can change this thing because it's really on a knife's edge if you look at any of these polls.
Yeah. How are you looking at it with a day out here, Rick, having seen the polling we got over the weekend, the conversations that were had going into Donald Trump's rally on Saturday night? How important is this event tomorrow?
Yeah, it's interesting how the setup is occurring. I mean, as you point out, the Time Siena poll shows it a dead heat. The decision desk headquarters is showing, sort of a +4 race for Harris. So she definitely took advantage of Joe Biden getting out. I would say the first debate may have been the most historical debate in modern political history because it forced a candidate to withdraw. So, I mean, to me, that's actually a pretty big impact. And I don't think this one will result in that. But the reality is, if you look at what the two candidates were doing last week, setting up this debate, a lot of the Donald Trump activity, which was almost frenetic in the public view, had him exposed to Q&A that didn't really go particularly well for him. And so I'm sure the weekend was spent trying to retool his approach to questions and answers, much different than his usual and comfortable, stand up and give an hour or two speech to a throng of fellow America Firsters. So, and then I'm sure Harris, who has not been in the room with Donald Trump in a way that is this kind of intimacy, is been spending the week really thinking about how she's going to react to that. And I think the stakes are high for both, but for completely, totally different reasons. I think they have completely different objectives in this debate, which is a little bit unusual.
I heard a remarkable statistic yesterday watching Sunday morning TV, because I'm that predictable, Jeannie. I believe it was ABC This Week. John Carl said that Donald Trump has taken part, or will, as of tomorrow night, have taken part in more presidential general election debates than any politician, any presidential candidate in American history. He's had a few turns at this. And the Associated Press today reports on Kamala Harris's prep. Intense debate camp in Pittsburgh, they say, has included studying Donald Trump's TV debates over the past 3 cycles, getting to know his policy positions, potential insults, readying to pitch the country on moving past the Trump era. So they're watching tape like they're getting ready for a game here, Jeannie. And I remember a lot of folks said, Joe Biden's biggest problem was that he was over-prepared. What do you think about this debate camp and how it's going for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, it sounded like Sunday football. And Joe, I have to admit, I was watching as well. And I did note when he said that, which is quite astonishing when you think about somebody who has consistently said, I'm not a politician, I'm from outside the swamp that is Washington, D.C. And yet here he is, the most practiced debater in American history now when it comes to televised debates. He knows what he's doing. He's done this many times. And as ineffective as he may have been with Joe Biden in the last debate on some of the particulars, overall, he was able to score some points. And we all remember his infamous line. He's done that over and over. So, I do not by any means underestimate Donald Trump's ability to do this, regardless of, whether he prepares I think Kamala Harris sounds a little bit more like Tom Brady, over preparing. Donald Trump seems to be a little bit loose. But he knows what he's doing. So I do think there is a danger that she comes across as a little bit robotic. He certainly wants her to use those word salads that she's known for. And that's going to be a challenge for her. But the biggest thing she's got to do is introduce herself to the American people, many of whom still don't know her. We see that in the polls, show that she is capable of being president. She is strong, differentiate herself a bit from Joe Biden, and show, to the New York Times polls point, that she is not the liberal that ran in 2019, 2020. She's learned and she is different. So she's got a lot of that. And then, I like to say she's got to be Tom Cruise. She's got to go in there and make, Donald Trump, Jack Nicholson, you need me on that wall. Can handle the truth, all of that, get him off his game like that.
I like this whole pitch here, a combo of Tom Cruise, Tom Brady. He doesn't eat the nightshades before a game, Jeannie. I don't know if she's following the whole TB12 diet here, but you do what you got to do, I guess, before the game. Rick, as someone who's prepared a presidential candidate for this forum,
How important is Donald Trump's experience, having done more of these than anyone, knowing at the same time that he's never taken them as seriously or prepared at least in the same way that a traditional candidate has? So what does that experience mean tomorrow night?
Yeah, I think that, one, he'll be calmer. This is high intensity kind of stuff for a presidential candidate. And so the fact that he's done so many over an extended period of time probably just lessens the anxiety, which gives him a little bit more clear-headed approach to going in. I would say, since this is her first at bat in a presidential debate and a relatively young presidential candidate, that this is going to be a little bit intimidating to Kamala Harris, and it should be. I mean, this is big stuff. This is literally her campaign in her own hands with nobody there to help her. And this will define probably as close to anything the outcome of the election. All the ads and all the grassroots efforts combined won't have the impact that this 90 minutes will have tomorrow night. And so that's pressure. So we'll see how she does with pressure, but she's got a relatively easy task, right? Don't screw up, no gaffes, and talk to the independent voters. Sound centrist in your views. Don't be crazy, and come out of there, as a rational adult, and just let Donald Trump be Donald Trump. That's enough to win the debate.
That's what they tell me every day when I come in here. It's just no gaffes, don't be crazy. It's not always that easy. Retail gasoline prices, Jeannie, 6-month low. We just talked to Bob McNally about this and the idea that the market, the global market in this case, is taking an issue away from Donald Trump that he would otherwise be looking forward to talking about. Crude oil sinking further into the 60s. You've got gas at a 6-month low. I just checked AAA, $3.27 nationally. Is that the best thing that's happened to her going into this debate in the last couple of days?
It's a good thing, but the truth is with Donald Trump, he never lets the facts and the numbers get in the way of what he wants to say. So, regardless of where the numbers are on the market, on inflation, on unemployment, on gas prices, he's still going to go in and make the case that people are living in a hellish world thanks to Harris, Biden, and he is going to fix all that. So, I don't think he's going to let all of those facts get in the way. I am curious to see, does he was using the word skullduggery this weekend, which I quite like. And, I like a good word that we don't hear a lot. So, I'm wondering if he engages in any skullduggery in advance of the debate, because we remember, bringing the women into the floor. Now he can't have any guests, no audience there, but do we see anybody on the outside who's designed to, sort of get Kamala Harris a little bit uncomfortable, make the environment a little tense, because Donald Trump likes to, do that kind of thing. So I wonder if we see him or his team bring anybody along standing outside there to sort of flap her if they can.
Deeply curious. Rick, what do you think about the energy conversation here? Is this something that the market is going to direct away from Kamala Harris, so Donald Trump can't hit her on gas prices, crude oil, et cetera, based on just what we're seeing here in a 6-month low?
I think he'll be intent to try and continue to prosecute the issues that he's used, and he just did. On Thursday, he raised this during his talk to the New York Economic Club. So my guess is he doesn't really care what the current existing price of gas is. He unlike you and me this weekend, he wasn't filling his car up, at the local Exxon. Right. And so I don't think he's really that sensitive to it. He will bludgeon you with an issue that has no relevance to fact. And I think he'll do that again. And the question really isn't whether he'll do it. The question is, how does she react to that? Is she going to school him on what the current price of oil is and why it's the way it is? I thought that your conversation about what was driving the market was fascinating. And to the extent that she has the capacity to do that, it would be an impressive put down by Harris over Trump.
It would, and vice versa. If Donald Trump can equate lower gas prices with a slowing economy, I'm not sure he's going to go there. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel, getting us ready for a big one tomorrow. We'll be lucky enough to have them both tomorrow as well, leading into our special coverage. Our signature panel back in hour 2. Kaylee Lyons will join as well. We've got a brand new week on our hands. Congress is back in town, and we're counting down to the presidential debate tomorrow night. 8 p.m. Eastern time is when you want to dial in here to Bloomberg Radio or find us on YouTube. As always, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's all Apple today. Tomorrow, it'll be all debate. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the candidates hunker down ahead of their first and possibly only debate in this campaign cycle. That'll be tomorrow. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington, where Congress is returning from a 6-week summer recess, Kaylee, but it's all eyes on Cupertino right now, isn't it?
Indeed. Probably the West Coast a little bit more interesting than the East Coast and here in the nation's capital today, although it is more crowded in D.C. now that Congress has made its return. It's been a lonely summer here in Washington.
A little quiet
They've been gone for a really long time.
Started taking things for granted like parking and no traffic. That all changes today.
Yeah, of course, they have quite a bit on their to-do list that they need to accomplish now that they've finally decided to grace their presence, grace Washington with their presence once again, as they are up against a clock. September 30th is the deadline to avert a government shutdown. And of course, the House is going to be making its first steps toward trying to do that this week, though they've attached the SAVE Act, non-citizens not being able to vote, something Democrats consider to be a poison pill.
Yeah, that's true. We'll do this exercise all over again. We can close our eyes and imagine, goes to the Senate, comes back, we'll bring it up to the wire, everyone will have countdown clocks, and then magically the government will be funded. Or will it this time? We'll talk more about that over the course of the hour. Mick Mulvaney is going to come in to give us his take on this. Ed Ludlow, by the way, is in Cupertino as we wait for the Apple headlines.
Yeah, we'll go to Ed in just a moment as we await a slew of updates we're expecting on a number of products, including the new iPhone. But first, let's get a check on Apple and the rest of the markets. Charlie Pellet has a look from up in New York.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we'll be hearing a whole lot more from Ed Ludlow coming up in just a moment. But Apple Monday, perhaps. Shares are trading lower. We got Apple stock down now by roughly 0.2%. This on a day when the U.S. stock market is ripping higher in sharp contrast to last week. Right now, the S&P best level of the day up 73 points, 54.81. A gain for that index of 1.4%. The Dow up 631 points, doing a little bit better, up by 1.6%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 214, up by about 1.3%. 10-year at 3.70%. The 2-year right now, 3.66%. Spot gold is climbing higher by 0.3%, 25.04 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.7%, 68.83 for a barrel of WTI. Boeing shares are rallying on optimism that a labor deal with its largest union will help the troubled aircraft manufacturer avoid a potentially crippling strike at its Seattle area factories. We got Boeing up now by 4%. Coming up after the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Oracle. Oracle right now up by about 0.3%. But as I mentioned on an update for the rest of the market, we do have Apple shares trading lower. Right now we got Apple down by about 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. It has begun in Cupertino. The big launch event for the iPhone 16 and a number of other products, including wearables, for example, we're expecting upgrades to. Joe, it is a big Apple Day. Remember, this was originally scheduled to be tomorrow, the day of the first presidential debate, and then Apple moved it up a day. They want the spotlight focused squarely.
Because who would want to do that on a Monday if you could help it, right? It's really interesting listening to Charlie Pellet there. Apple stock is down, but it's always down on days like these. Is that because everyone's been trading on it for weeks? Everyone knows what's coming, selling on the news?
Some clues from the likes of our colleague, Mark Gurman, who always has the scoop on these things. But yeah, it is an interesting question.
Ed Ludlow is there, of course, and part of our coverage there for Bloomberg in Cupertino, and joins us right now with more. Ed, there's been a lot of talk about AI in this new generation of iPhones. Forget what's happening now and what the stock is doing. Are we going to look back at today as an important inflection point, a turning point in consumer-facing AI?
Yeah, it comes down to a very simple question for Apple to answer for everyday people around the world, which is Apple Intelligence, their offering in the domain of AI or on-device generative AI, what does it do for me? How do I use it in my daily personal and professional life? And, you know, we will get new iPhones. We can get into that. We will be disappointed by the stock reaction, probably, Joe. But that's the fundamental question. If I get access to this AI tool, what do I do with it?
Well, and is AI going to be a thing that actually sells more iPhones? Ed, what realistically is the expectation here of the upgrade cycle for the iPhone 16? Are consumers going to be driven to go purchase a new phone and potentially pay more for it? I'm not sure about the pricing because of the AI upgrades in it.
that there are industry and Wall Street analysts that are incredibly bullish about the prospects of a super cycle driven by on-device AI in the same way that 5G networks drove that. What we know from the reporting is that we'll get a new iPhone 16 generation, right? 4 variants of it, a base, a Plus, a Pro, and a Pro Max. But to all intents and purposes, the hardware differences from iPhone 15 are very small. And when Apple does roll out Apple Intelligence in October, it will be available on the prior generation 15 anyway. So it comes down to software more than hardware. And China's an interesting example, right, guys? Because it won't even be available in China in the first instance. I'm talking about Apple Intelligence. But there is evidence that nonetheless consumers will buy this handset, hoping that in the future China gives the regulatory approvals needed to bring the software there.
Well, we know the number of people who have not upgraded in a couple of cycles. So indeed, Ed, if this is a super cycle, and we hear that a lot about this new generation, what do we need to hear today, or what will we hear in the next hour or so that confirms that possibility?
The problem that Apple's got is that a lot of the promise of Apple Intelligence we learned about in June. And so you take the combination of sort of thinner hardware updates, what we already know about the software offering. Super cycles are also driven by economics, the consumer's strength and willingness to spend money around the world. Now, in markets like North America, middle and higher income households are resilient, but lower income households are not. In China, I think we're still a little concerned about the macro picture. All of that combines to go back to my first question, which is, am I convinced that this will change the way I interact with my phone every day? And Apple's pretty good at telling stories during these presentations, and that's the hurdle they'll have to get over.
Well, Apple has now officially announced a redesigned Apple Watch Series 10. We knew wearables were going to be part of the presentation today, Ed. Yes. But as you talk about, Apple's good at telling stories. They're also good at getting people bought into the ecosystem. You get the phone, you get the watch, you get the AirPods, you maybe include an iPad and a pencil in there. What else do we need to know about the wearables division and what they're going to be trying to accomplish here?
So that watch confirmation is confirmation of Mark Gurman's reporting at Bloomberg. You have to think about wearables as an important category with a lower barrier to entry. You know, the Pro model is probably going to cost $1,000. We'll find out. But the wearables have a lower price point, so it brings other buyers who might not buy the smartphone handset into that ecosystem. It's also been a couple of years, particularly on the AirPods side, since we've had a refresh, 2022. People like technology. And what we're expecting is an entry and midpoint refresh on the AirPods that people will buy into, and potentially new customers, people that haven't owned an Apple product before, buy into as well. And so if you take wearables and iPhone in aggregate, that's 60% of Apple's revenue. It really matters.
Indeed. And Ed Ludlow, of course, will have coverage of all of this from Cupertino. We'll keep checking in with you, Ed, throughout the hour as we get more announcements out of this product event that, of course, as we mentioned, Apple is doing today, so as not to have to counter-program or share attention with the presidential debate tomorrow.
I feel like they could have gotten away with that. It's still pretty early. The debate's at 9, but okay, deferential. I get that. I just want to know, what does it do for me, though? I'm still waiting to hear that fundamental question that Ed asked to be answered. Does it help me prepare for the show? Yeah. Is it going to, what do I get, recipes on this thing? Like, what serious work will this actually help me with? Will it help me decide who to vote for?
And how does it differentiate itself from other artificial intelligence products that are already out there?
Well, this is the moment. Like you said, Tim Cook with a story to tell here. We'll let you know what he tells us.
Indeed. We'll have more with Ed Ludlow coming up later on this hour, but we want to turn the attention back to politics. And our next guest joining us is someone who focuses specifically on getting Democratic women elected into office. Emily's List is the organization, and its president, Jessica Mackler, is here with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Jessica. It's good to have you, especially on the eve of this first presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, a woman of color against the former president. Jessica, if we could just begin with what message Kamala Harris needs to deliver on that stage tomorrow that targets female voters in particular.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think what we're going to see tomorrow night is what Kamala Harris has been sharing with the public since she launched this campaign at the helm, and that is a vision for what kind of future we're going to have in this country. And what does that future look like? And that's particularly important when it comes to reproductive freedom, which has been the driving issue for voters, women voters in particular, since the Dobbs decision. And she has laid out for people a future in which we can restore these freedoms and rights that have been stripped away from us, in which people can not just get by, but can thrive. And that stands in stark contrast to what is being offered by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, which is a future in which we go backwards, a future that is governed by the principles of the Project 2025 agenda. So I think that's what we're going to see on stage tomorrow night, and that's what we have been hearing from her since she launched this campaign.
Well, Jessica, we've seen Donald Trump on stage with a female candidate before. Just ask Hillary Clinton how that went. And there have been a lot of questions about that, how that changes the dynamic in this cycle, of course, versus the first debate that we saw him in with Joe Biden. To what extent should Donald Trump's past interactions with Hillary Clinton in this case, knowing that Kamala Harris is reviewing debate footage right now as part of her prep, how does that impact or color the way that Kamala Harris will approach this conversation tomorrow night?
Well, I think the important thing when it comes to Donald Trump is to really be prepared for anything. We have to remember that Donald Trump has been a performer his entire life. And so
he also speaks differently to women than he does to men, doesn't he?
And he often does. He often does. But we don't know which Donald Trump is going to show up tomorrow night, right? We don't know what he's going to be like. I would expect that he has prepped very well for this. This is his 7th national presidential debate that he is engaging in. So he has a lot of practice at this. I would expect that we would see, and I think we have to plan to see kind of the performer of Donald Trump, though the person who shows up and uses all the tools in his toolbox, which for him, that's lies, that's distraction, that's manipulation. He's not tethered by the truth. Anything that he can use is to present a different portrait to the American people than what we know is the reality of what kind of president that he is going to be. So we have to be prepared for the Donald Trump that showed up in 2016, but we also have to be prepared for a Donald Trump who shows up and holds it together for 90 minutes. But what we know is that no matter which Donald Trump shows up, that's what's going to be really important. And what I know she's preparing for is to really lay out that choice that's in front of voters.
Well, of course, voters already are sharing with pollsters how they're thinking about this choice. The latest New York Times Siena poll that came out this weekend finds Trump ahead by 1 point nationally, though that is within the margin of error. But the issue breakdown is what I find incredibly interesting here, Jessica. Trump holds a 13 percentage point advantage on the issue of the economy. Vice President Harris holds a 15 percentage point advantage on the issue of abortion. Now, our listeners on Bloomberg Radio may not see it over your right shoulder, but you have a sign behind you that literally says, "Keep abortion legal." How should we be thinking about the way in which not just Harris, but other female candidates that you were trying to see elected should be using that issue to their advantage this cycle?
Absolutely. Well, I will tell you, we have done a lot of research, not just in this election cycle, but in past election cycles around voters, women voters in particular. And I can tell you that reproductive freedom, as it has been since the Dobbs decision, is going to be a determinative issue in this election. For women, young women in particular, this is a deal breaker issue for them. And you see it in those advantages. We have to remember that Kamala Harris is still introducing herself to a large section of the electorate. They may know of her and have seen her in her role as vice president, but they don't necessarily have the depth and breadth of knowledge. And so that's work that she's still doing. She's rolled out policy positions on economic policy that show that just like on the issue of reproductive freedom, she is going to be a person who stands up every day and fights for the people of this country. But when it comes to what is going to deliver the win in this election cycle is going to be won once again on reproductive freedom. And Kamala Harris has been very clear throughout her career and throughout this campaign that she is the candidate who is going to stand up for restoring these rights, for defending our freedoms, while Donald Trump is going to take us back. And we know that a vote for Donald Trump is a vote for a national abortion ban.
A couple of pretty fascinating statistics here, Jessica. 60% of donors to the Harris campaign in July were made up of women. Another one that was remarkable to read this morning. The number of women in the United States registered to vote is typically 7 to 10 million more than the number of men. That's according to the Center for American Women and Politics. Is the takeaway that women, one way or the other, will decide this election?
Women absolutely will decide this election. And I'm going to offer you one more stat because women, young women in particular, have the ability to be determinative in this election. We have seen in our research that between April and the end of July, a 56-point swing in motivation to vote from young women. That's women under 45. That's incredible. Those are not numbers that we see every day. But we also see that reflected whether it's in the long lines of people that are waiting in the summer heat to get into a Kamala Harris rally, or the spikes in voter registration that are being driven by young women and young women of color in particular. We see it in the record-breaking grassroots contributions. We see it in the volunteer shifts. So there is incredible enthusiasm and energy from women in this election. And we know that it's a diverse coalition of women who are going to deliver this victory for Kamala Harris and for women up and down the ballot. And they're going to do so on the issue of reproductive freedom.
Well, and so let's talk about other women down the ballot. Of course, there's a number of vulnerable incumbent Democratic senators. I could think of female ones, Tammy Baldwin, Jackie Rosen, for example. There's also women who are trying to unseat Republicans, including the challenger of Rick Scott in Florida. How are you realistically looking at the races and the way in which women could have a role in determining the ultimate balance of the Senate in particular? Like, for example, do you think that Florida race is actually winnable?
Well, I can tell you that Democratic pro-choice women running at all levels of the ballot are going to be the drivers of securing Democratic pro-choice majorities at all levels of the ballot. And we know that we need those majorities if we are going to fully restore our rights. So everywhere from the state legislative chambers in Arizona and Wisconsin and New Hampshire that we can flip in this election cycle to the battle for control of the House of Representatives, to the Senate, as you named, with Jackie Rosen, Tammy Baldwin, Angela also Brooks in Maryland, a really important race, Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan, and Debbie Merkersell-Powell in Florida, and Gloria Johnson in Tennessee. Those races are in play because of the salience of the issue of reproductive freedom. In Florida in particular, as you mentioned, we have an opportunity, voters will have an opportunity to vote on the issue of reproductive freedom and restore those rights in state law. But they also have an opportunity to make sure that Debbie Merkersell-Powell goes to the Senate, that we don't have Rick Scott as Senate Majority Leader. And we know that in that race, like all of these other races, it comes down to who is going to stand up for these rights. And I think there's great opportunity in Florida and across the map, because we've seen that when we frame these races around the choices on reproductive freedom and abortion rights, Democrats win.
Jessica, it's great to have you back with us on Bloomberg. I'm sure that you'll be watching along with us tomorrow night. Jessica Mackler, President Emily's List, with fascinating insights, Kaylee, as we get ready for this showdown tomorrow. And the fundraising that we've heard over the past couple of days, combined with the results in that Siena poll, really bring us to this conversation with a fascinating backdrop. We were talking about the poll. They're in a statistical tie on the headline, but among young women in the swing states, Siena College says 38% prefer, a 38% advantage for Harris, 67 to 29%, overwhelming for a single demographic.
Yeah, the demographic shifts we have seen since Harris took the helm as the nominee over Joe Biden have been pretty substantial. And of course, it is these varying different demographics that both candidates will be trying to speak to on the stage tomorrow night. We'll have more on that ahead with our political panel.
Yeah, Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano are with us today. They'll be with us tomorrow for the debate as well. So keep it right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with headlines out of Cupertino. The Apple event underway. Apple says its new watch will include sleep apnea detection. Also says the Watch Series 10 will start at $399 and be available on September 20th. With the Apple event underway, shares are trading lower. Yes, a little change, down by about 0.1%. But all of this on a day when stocks are at the best level of the session. S&P up 70 right now, up by about 1.3%. We've got the Dow up 574, up 1.4%. NASDAQ also pushing higher, up 1.3%. 10-year 3.69%, the 2-year 3.65%. Spot gold up 0.2%, 25.02 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.2%, 68.51 a barrel. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. I am indeed Kaylee Limes alongside Joe Matthew, broadcasting live on Bloomberg Television and Radio from Washington, as we have been doing for basically the entire summer, except for the weeks that we were at the conventions. The same can't be said about working in Washington for more than 435 people on Capitol Hill who've been away for a really long time. This has been an extended August recess that Congress has been in, but today they make their return to the nation's capital.
That's right. They're back. Rules Committee meeting is at 4 p.m., I think, Eastern Time. Not expected to go well. Thomas Massey already says he's a no vote. This, of course, is an effort to fund the government past this month. We run out of money on September 30. So they have 3 weeks, Kaylee, to come up with a plan. And you know how well that's gone the last couple of times. We bring it right up to the wire. And Mike Johnson, the speaker, wants a 6-month stopgap to kick the can. It includes something called the SAVE Act. That's a big no for Democrats because it requires essentially identification to vote. It would make it illegal for a non-citizen to vote, except as the White House points out, already is.
Yeah.
Got a statement from the White House today.
Indeed. The administration urging House Republicans to engage in a bipartisan process to keep the government open. And yes, to your point, they point out that it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. It is a federal crime punishable by prison and fines. They would veto this legislation. Of course, it's not going to make it through the Senate anyway.
That's correct. And so it'll come back around, and you've seen this movie, Senate jams the House, everyone complains. Then maybe we have a deal and avoid a shutdown. That's what's happened so far, and they tend to think that an election day might be some inspiration to get this done. Let's see what the panel thinks. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Of course, Rick, a partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie is a political science professor at Iona University. It's great to see both of you here. There's more on this, Rick. The White House says the bill is especially irresponsible when it comes to national security. Quote, as a 6-month CR would erode our military advantage relative to the People's Republic of China, degrade readiness, fail to provide the support our troops deserve, unquote. Are we going to have a real fight here with the risk of a shutdown, or is this all bluster?
You know, I think a lot of this is positioning, but look, legitimately, when you do a continuing resolution, that means last year's budget prevails. And there was a sizable increase in spending given to the Defense Department this year that they're not going to be able to touch. And so all these plans that they've been making to beef up their presence in the South China Sea and the Pacific, to be able to help fund our allies in the region, to bolster our deterrence against China toward Taiwan, all that gets put on hold. And so these things are not just congressional, machinations that, politics is the only thing at risk. These are serious setbacks for American decision making where we can't implement the hard fought wins that these agencies get, and or the reverse is those cuts that are embedded in those annual spending bills don't get implemented if it's in a continuing resolution. So it's incapacitating the executive branch to a large degree.
Well, so Jeannie, it raises the question as the prevailing wisdom here in Washington on all sides seems to be no one wants the government to shut down because it's a bad look politically when you're trying to get reelected into the House, for example. But is it not also a bad look politically to not be able to just sort out the appropriations bills as required, kicking the can down the road yet again? Is that really what voters want of their elected representatives?
I don't think anybody wants any of this. And you're absolutely right, Kaylee. It is bad politics. Mike Johnson knows it. Everybody knows it. You don't shut down the government. That said, our Congress has done things that are bad politics and that everybody says are just the height of craziness. So while I don't think it's going to happen, you can't say for certain at this point. You know, and of course, this is no way to budget. And as the White House says in their statement that Joe was just reading, this is no way to run a government. You don't run from CR to CR to CR. We've got to get on both sides, not just with Republicans, on both sides, to a sound fiscal budgeting policy. Everybody knows how to do it, and yet the politics of this thing have prevented it for so long. And just as an example of that, I mean, the inclusion of the SAVE Act here is basically Mike Johnson saying to his base and to Republicans, look at, I am serving you. Please, you know, reelect me when my vote comes up. That is a way to budget as well. We know that you can only vote in this country if you are a citizen. So why are we trying to guard against something that is already clearly illegal?
Well, we're just a day out from the big presidential debate, and I do want to ask you both about news on the campaign trail. I'm sure Donald Trump will make a phone call to Michael Johnson at some point about the stopgap here, but there's a story in the Wall Street Journal, Rick. It's called Trump's Problem in Michigan, and it goes to ground in one of the most important counties, in arguably the most important state in the nation here for winning the election, with some local party leaders in Macomb County, one of 4 the Trump campaign has pegged as must win. Party leaders locally are refusing to follow the Trump campaign's ground strategy, which relies on an app to identify persuadable voters. They are pledging instead to use their own tried and true system to decide which homes to visit. As a result, they've not been able to start knocking on doors. In August, they were not able to because of the disagreement. As somebody who's run a presidential campaign, Rick, what does this isolated example tell you about the greater organization?
Well, this isolated example is just that in a much broader and much more systemic problem with the Michigan GOP. A couple of years ago, it was taken over by a bunch of MAGA, America Firsters. You know, this is the GOP that gave us Gerald Ford and George Romney, and you know, had a history of domination in, you know, having Republicans occupy both the House, the Senate, and the governorship, and now they can't win a single statewide, and actually fear turning over all 3 chambers to the Democrats this year, including potentially a presidential win. So this is a fall from grace like none we've seen, and even Donald Trump has had to intercede and, you know, to try and save his own campaign there and elect Pete Hoekstra, a rhino in any other given year, to the chairmanship, which has upset his own team. So there's mass confusion. There's not a lot of money available, and volunteers are hard to get because they're fighting with each other. So I would say it could cost the Trump campaign the election in Michigan, because I would say this would at least attribute 1 or 2 percentage points to the bottom line and not being able to get out your vote.
Wow.
That's huge.
Well, so Jeannie, does that mean Kamala Harris should double down on the ground game in Michigan, or she could divert more resources elsewhere if the Trump campaign is disorganized there?
You know, she's got a lot of resources, as we've talked about. I think she needs to double down. I think Democrats know what happened in the Midwest and the Rust Belt to Hillary Clinton. They can't risk it. And as we've seen from the polls, the New York Times, just the latest poll to show this is on a knife's edge. She does not, by any stretch of the imagination, have this thing wrapped up. She is the underdog. So double down on that and thank your lucky stars that Republicans are in disarray in Michigan, because it's a good sign for Democrats. They can fight hard there. Mostly they've got to fight really, really hard and continually in the place where she seems to be moving in now, which is Pennsylvania.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our signature political panel. Thank you so much. We'll, of course, have more from Rick and Jeannie later on today and tomorrow as we beat the drum toward the presidential debate in which we'll see Donald Trump and Kamala Harris sharing a stage. Thank you so much. Well, all eyes will be on Philadelphia tomorrow. They're on Cupertino today with the big event Apple is hosting. We already know the Series 10 watch, and now just announced the AirPods 4 will be coming out, this giant technology company, and that is where we find Ed Ludlow. He's outside the building in Cupertino. So Ed, satin black on the new watch. What do we need to know about the actual hardware beyond the color?
Yeah, I mean, there's a heavy emphasis on basically materials and the value you get for the price point you pay when it comes to the watch. A lot of the features they've announced are in line with what Bloomberg's Mark Gurman reported. But what's really interesting, particularly our discussion earlier about China, is the emphasis on this is a jewelry product. This is not just function, but fashion. You know what I mean? And that appeals to very important markets like China, where Apple is still seen as sort of a status symbol. So that's kind of interesting to track. But in the presentation, the executives are all sort of in their activewear running around San Francisco by the Golden Gate Bridge. And it reminds you that they are trying to pitch to that sports market, water sports, activities out and about as well. So this is classic Apple, guys.
Sleep apnea emerges as a new feature. Ed, what else are we going to hear today? How long is this program going?
So it will go for another hour or so, and that sleep apnea is another confirmation of Bloomberg reporting, but really important, you know, new medical functionality. Because remember, in conjunction with Apple's services ambition, it's an area that they've looked at. They want to add more functionality to the watch, while things like blood glucose and blood oxygen are up for debate. You'll be aware of the litigation with Massimo, for example. They are seeking FDA approval, which they say is close and will come soon. And what's important to note is that the sleep apnea detection is not unique to just one generation of the watch. It seems as if they'll roll it out more broadly. You know, sleep apnea is something that a lot of people face all around the world.
Well, and it raises the question of the price point as well. We understand the series is going to start at $399. Do we know how high ultimately these products are going to go in terms of cost?
Well, one factor when it comes to the watch is all of the extra stuff that goes with it. You know, Kaylee, I know you got some good taste, and if you want yourself an Hermes wrist strap, then that will be an added cost as well. But remember what we talked about earlier. For, you know, that price point, don't laugh. This is serious stuff. $399 is a lower barrier to entry for wearables than a smartphone handset that costs $1,000. So keep that context in mind.
All right.
You got that?
Yeah, Ed Ludlow reading me like a book here.
Yeah, I love this. This is great. I mean, you are the case study here as someone gripped by the ecosystem, correct?
Oh,
Can we say that on the air?
I have watch, I have the phone, I have 2 sets of AirPods, but I mean, maybe I need some new ones.
Stock still down?
It always is.
What's the stock doing?
Good question.
Here we go.
We'll find that out for you.
Yeah, we're still down. 220, down 36 cents. That's
New
what
headline,
always
Joe.
happens on these days. Oh, look at
New
this.
colors and a USB-C to the AirPods Max headphones.
You still going to buy them? Yeah?
USB-C?
No?
Maybe.
Do you have the blue headphones? Do you have the fancy ones, or you just do the AirPods?
Just the AirPods.
I like those big ones. Maybe that'll be my treat. A lot more ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with more headlines out of Cupertino and Apple. Apple introducing a number of product enhancements at its event now underway. It says its new AirPods feature better audio and a smaller case. Also says it will include a hearing test. Apple unveiling a new version of its smartwatch with a bigger screen. We are awaiting word on the iPhone 16 smartphone. All of this, so as Apple shares continue to trade little change right now, Apple is unchanged on the day. Stocks higher across the board. S&P up 71, up by 1.3%. We are seeing a renewed wave of dip buying. The Dow up 588, up 1.5%, while NASDAQ is up 212, up by about 1.3%. Stocks are trading very close to session highs. 10-year 3.69%, the 2-year 3.66%. Gold up $7 the ounce, $25.04, up by about 0.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.4%, $68.64 a barrel. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Joe and I here, as we keep an eye on Washington and all the things political, are also just fascinated by these new product developments from Apple. AirPods that act as a hearing aid effectively. This feels like pretty revolutionary stuff, at least for a technology company, not a medical device company.
You got the Pro AirPods with the noise canceling, right? So that becomes a feature on the standard regular AirPods. But to see this hearing prevention, hearing test, hearing aid could be a major disruption, as Mark Gurman says. He was ahead on a lot of this stuff that we're learning today, but this is a new one.
Well, and it's interesting. We have the hearing aid element of the AirPods. You have the sleep apnea element of the new watch. Already we know that Apple had been adding more and more health features to this technology, but it is interesting to see the nexus here. And it makes you wonder what some of these medical device companies that like those that make hearing aids, how they'll be impacted by this.
This stuff sells for sure. Ed Ludlow's doing a great job keeping us posted on what's happening in Cupertino. We'll let you know when we learn more about AI. That was also a big part of this year with the new
They just announced
iPhone.
that
We've got this.
Apple
Here we go.
Intelligence
Look at
iPhone
that.
16.
So they're calling it Apple Intelligence. That's pretty good branding on the AI front here, right? The question is, what will it mean for the consumer, and to what extent will these features inspire people to upgrade? They're talking about a super cycle. This could be the secret ingredient. Mick Mulvaney's got to be excited about all of this. The former acting White House chief of staff of the Trump White House, of course, former member of Congress, co-founder of the Freedom Caucus. I'm guessing you're an Apple guy, Mick, or are you going to tell me you're an Android guy because you're an open source type? Which is it?
No, I'm an Apple guy. It's just easier to have everything talk to each other. I'm a little concerned about buying medical devices from a consumer products company, but I'm sure we'll figure out the way to handle that.
I'm sure that's true. Of course, we wanted to talk to you about politics today and whether the government's going to shut down at the end of this month. And I know nobody's talking about that yet, Mick, but when you look at the response from the White House to this CR proposal, knowing that Democrats don't like the SAVE Act because, well, it makes something illegal that's already illegal. And then you've got members of your old Freedom Caucus, Tom Massey, the first to say no more stopgaps. So how hard is this going to be this time?
Oh, it's going to be the exact same difficulty as it is every single time we do this. I mean, I'm surprised. You know, what we could do, y'all, is just go back a year, see whatever conversation we had about the government shutdown last time, and play the exact same clips, and then we could take the rest of the afternoon off. You're going to have the Defense Department saying how bad a stopgap is. You're going to have the Democrats wailing and gnashing their teeth saying people won't get paid and things are going to, the museums are going to close, et cetera. And the Republicans will talk about the $36 trillion debt. I guess you have to change the number because it used to, only be 32 or 33 last year, so maybe we could dub that in. But it's going to be the exact same conversation. And my guess is the exact same dynamics. There'll either be a very short-term shutdown, or they'll go right up to the final moments and do some sort of short-term stopgaps. But overall, the spending is not going to change. Washington's not going to change. So until you get something dramatic, we're just going to do the same old song and dance.
But this stopgap in particular isn't that short-term. Johnson wants this 6 months extension until March, when we'll have a new president and could very well have a new Congress. Mick, do you read that as a bet that Johnson wants to have this fight with a new administration or potentially be the one to still spearhead this as House Speaker. Two things need to happen for that, right? The House Republicans need to retain the majority, and they still need to decide again that they want Mike Johnson in charge.
I mean, put yourself in the Republican shoes in the House, right? We've only got one branch of government right now. We think we're going to take the Senate. We've got a 50-50 chance of taking the White House. So why cut a whole year-long deal now when you can sort of take the chance, you get past the next election and maybe get a little bit better deal? Keep in mind, they did the same thing back in 2016, thinking that if the Republicans ran the table, we'd get a great spending deal, and we didn't. We had the House, the Senate, and the White House, and the Republicans effectively did the same thing the Democrats have been doing, which is to spend a lot of money. By the way, that brings no joy to the former budget director to say that, but that's the way Washington works, especially with the 60-vote rule in the Senate. So, yeah, look, ultimately, you do what the Senate wants because the House doesn't have to be bipartisan and the Senate does. So the Senate usually gets what it wants on this unless the House or the White House is willing to stomach a government shutdown. Donald Trump was willing to have that battle for, 45 days? But my guess is that Mike Johnson doesn't have the stomach for that going into an election, and certainly the White House doesn't want to see a shutdown.
Kind of interesting, Mick, to see Donald Trump warming up to cannabis over the past week or so. First, he said he would vote for this. Well, first he said he'd vote for this referendum in Florida. Now he says he supports federally rescheduling marijuana, which has been extremely controversial and a non-starter for a lot of Republicans, as well as the Safe Banking Act. He is open to providing banking services to companies in the cannabis industry. What do you make of this? I'm assuming this is not second nature to your former boss. What's inspiring him to go here, and could this actually give Republicans in the House the green light, or in the Senate for that matter, it's already passed the House a dozen times or something, to move ahead with the Safe Banking Act?
Yeah, a couple things. Let's be clear. When you say Donald Trump is warming up to cannabis, that's figurative and not literal, just to be clear.
Fair enough.
The SAFE Act is sort of off on its own. The SAFE Act is a good piece of legislation, and I'm not just saying that because I co-sponsored with Perlmutter, Ed Perlmutter, several years ago. It's the one that essentially says if you're dealing in a state where it's legal, you can have access to the financial services industries. Right now, you can't, and most of the cannabis business in this country is done in cash, which is really, it's not that safe. But put that aside. Look, your larger question is a fair question, a good question. Is Donald Trump sort of moving to the center on this? And the answer is yes. He believes that it's a way to pick up some of the younger voters. His core principles don't involve cannabis, right? His core principles are things like taxes and regulation and the border and tariffs. So he's sort of able to have a little flexibility, at least in his own mind, when it comes to something like cannabis. So if he can find a compromise that keeps, a large number of people in Congress and a large number of voters happy, it wouldn't surprise me if he tries to find that.
Finally, Mick, one final question around your former boss, specifically a new ad targeting him from the Harris campaign. It's titled "The Best People" and shows a number of officials from the former administration in which you served. Here's a taste.
Donald Trump said he would choose only the best people to work in his White House. Now those people have a warning for America. Trump is not fit to be president again. Here's his vice president.
Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States.
Mick, of course, you worked in this administration. You, after January 6th, distanced yourself a bit from the former president. You have now come back around on him. Not many other officials from the administration have, though. Do you expect that will be happening before November, or are they distanced for a reason?
I don't know if that's entirely correct. I know of a lot of Republicans who did not support Donald Trump during the primaries, as I did not. I didn't support anybody. We're saying, look, give me a choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I'll vote for Donald Trump. I'm thinking I'm sorry, and I mean no disrespect like that. I know Joe mentioned that last time. I'm sorry, I just called her Kamala for so long. I keep forgetting it's Kamala. But look, Bill Barr, I said he's going to vote for Trump. I'm voting for Donald Trump. A lot of folks who ran against him in the primary, Nikki Haley, is voting for Donald Trump. So, look, I get it. I know he rubs a lot of people the wrong way, especially folks who are in the military. I think if you went through that, I didn't see that ad. I can only hear it. But my guess is a lot of the folks are former military. And why Donald Trump thought he'd get along with folks who are lifetime military, I have no idea. But clearly, Jim Mattis, John Kelly really, really don't like the president. I get that. What I can't get, Kaylee, is this whole, Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney saying they're going to actually vote for Joe Biden. That makes me wonder if they were really Republican in the first place. I could see Republicans who say, you know what, I can't bring myself to vote for Trump. But to vote for the most progressive left-wing candidate this country's ever seen before, that tells me a lot about more about the Cheneys than it does about Donald Trump.
Interesting. Well, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts following the debate, Mick. Come back and talk to us soon. Mick Mulvaney with us here live on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Again, we will have special coverage of the debate tomorrow night. Kaylee and I will be here live from Washington, along with our signature panel starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The governor of Connecticut, Kaylee's going to be watching too, and we have an opportunity to talk to Ned Lamont right now from my former native state. Well, my former state, I guess it's still my native state, the Nutmeg State. He's speaking on behalf of the Harris Walz campaign as a supporter. Governor Lamont, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. What is job number one for Kamala Harris tomorrow night, knowing these two have never met, they've never shared a stage together, never mind a political debate?
Well, sometimes I think that Donald Trump is a professional debater, but I think Kamala knows how to get things done. I come out of small business. I started up a telecommunications company. I love the fact that she wants to be a champion for small business. More new business startups than ever before. Making it easier to start up a small business. Making it easier to get that first loan. Make it easier for you to get a child in daycare. Clear away some of that red tape. If she can show she's a champion for small business, she's a champion for all of us.
Well, of course, small businesses, as we've seen in the last several years, Governor, have felt inflation pretty severely, both in terms of goods, of people that they need to hire. Are you concerned that some of these policies that Harris is outlining that are intended to support small business could actually be inflationary, add to the deficit, and actually ultimately have a negative economic effect?
No, I think Biden-Harris has been pretty good at bringing down inflation. Obviously, we had a big spike coming out of COVID. What I worry about is Donald Trump and tariffs anywhere from 10 to 100%. Let me tell you what that would do to inflation. Let me tell you, that would be the biggest middle-class tax increase we've seen in many a year.
Well, okay. And Kamala Harris has some blanks to fill in when it comes to her economic proposals. There are a lot of questions, for instance, about what her energy policy would be. We know that she no longer wants to see a ban on fracking, but Donald Trump says he wants to unlock American energy, that drill baby drill will be the centerpiece of his fight against inflation. Will Kamala Harris, for instance, bring an end to the moratorium on LNG exports? Can she make some news there tomorrow that might bring some sunlight between herself and Joe Biden?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of what the vice president's going to say tomorrow. I can tell you, under Biden-Harris, there's been more new energy production, and that we are producing more energy than ever before. And I think they're doing it cautiously. They're trying to preserve our open spaces as best as we can. I come from a state, Connecticut, where we got to bring in more energy resources to bring down the price of electricity. So I very much look forward to working with President Harris on that.
Well, Governor, I'm sure you've seen the new New York Times Siena poll that finds Trump 1 point ahead of her nationally within the margin of error, but it also finds that 47% of those surveyed likely voters view Vice President Harris as too liberal. How can she correct that thinking?
Look, it's going to be a dead heat, this race, so that's why every vote matters so much. Look, I think they will try and portray her as very liberal. He'll come back and say, I was a tough prosecutor. I put criminals behind bars. I'm a champion for small business. Donald Trump is a champion for big business and crony capitalism. I think she'll have to stay on offense to say she believes in the same American dream you do.
Governor, I grew up in a small town in Northeast Connecticut that was a big manufacturing hub in the olden days. All of the factories there closed when I was growing up, and they all became antique stores. What will Kamala Harris do to bring manufacturing back to America?
What town was that? We got to do better. I will tell you, Joe, that We have more manufacturing going on in this state than we have in a generation. A lot of that is defense related. A lot of that is new startups. Manufacturing is onshoring over the last 5 years. As it becomes more capital intensive, the quality of your workforce able to work with this computerized equipment is very important. And I think that's why you see manufacturing a big piece of our state in the future.
The beautiful city of Putnam, Connecticut, Kaylee. The quiet corner, they call it.
All right, I've never been.
Thank you, Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut. I'll meet you back here, Kaylee. The late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And live from the Bloomberg studios in New York, it is Bloomberg Business Week. We're on Bloomberg Television, Radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Tim Stenevec. Carol Masser is off today. In her place is Katie Greifeld of Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg News. And Katie, I believe it was you who said We're back.
We're so
Are
back.
we?
Stocks are ripping, bond yields are down a little bit. All those bad memories you have of last week, you can forget them for at least right now.
Okay, we're going to have much more on the markets in just a minute, and the environment, of course. In the meantime, shares of Apple are lower. This is Apple's annual iPhone event is underway. The company announces that iPhone 16 and more. We're going to check in with our reporter on the ground in Cupertino. And then one of the reporters behind today's big take about how Apple rules the world.
And fresh off his hour-long sit-down with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, we'll check in with David Gura before he'll be on the ground in Philadelphia for the presidential debate tomorrow.
And Boeing rallying on optimism that a labor deal will avert a strike. What you need to know from our Bloomberg Intelligence, Aerospace, and Defense analyst. All that and more over the next hour on Bloomberg Business Week. First up, though, a check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pella.
Hi, thank you very much indeed. Happy Monday to the both of you. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now. Apple shares, though, a notable exception. We'll keep you updated on developments out of Cupertino. Right now, we got Apple trading lower, down by 0.9%. Apple has introduced the latest version of its flagship product, the iPhone 16. CEO Tim Cook saying it was designed to take advantage of artificial intelligence from the ground up. The iPhone 16 and 16 Plus will be available in new colors. Not all about the iPhone, however. Apple also has unveiled a version of its new smartwatch with a bigger screen and the ability to detect sleep apnea, as well as new software that can turn AirPods into hearing aids. Again, we've got Apple shares trading lower. Apple now down by a full percent. And of course, we'll have a whole lot more coming up from Cupertino with our Ed Ludlow. Stocks higher across the board. We're off session highs, but the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they're all rallying right now. S&P up 55, 54.63, a gain of 1%. Dow Industrials up 462, now up 1.1%, and the NASDAQ Composite Index up 0.9%. NASDAQ 100 Index doing a little bit better, up by 1%. Russell 2000 up 0.6%. 10-year at 3.70%, but the 2-year that's now yielding 3.66%. Gold up 0.1%, 2,500 even on the precious metal, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.6%, 68.72 a barrel. So again, recapping, stocks higher, Apple lower, Apple shares down by 1%, S&P 500 index up by 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much, Charlie. Do appreciate that Bloomberg Business Flash. Well, shares of Apple lower right now by about a percentage point. The company holding its product launch event at its headquarters today at Apple Park in Cupertino, California. Right now, announcing details of the iPhone 16, a refresh of AirPods, Apple Watch as well, and more. The keynote continuing to be underway. We've also got a great live blog covering the event. I encourage everybody to check that out, too. Let's go now to Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Technology on Bloomberg TV. He's been at Apple Park in Cupertino, California since the wee hours of the morning, and we appreciate that. He joins us now. Ed, what is one new thing that you learned today?
Oh, goodness. Well, one new thing that I learned today is that what's old is new. We have a button called camera control on the iPhone 16 generation. And you think of it as something akin to the shutter button on a DSLR camera for you photography enthusiasts out there. You know, very simply, if you're holding the iPhone 16 in your hand and you see something, you're desperate to take a photograph, bam, hit the camera control button, camera comes up. But don't worry, Tim, you don't need to turn your hand or readjust or turn the screen. Boom, just hit the button again and it takes a photo. This is groundbreaking innovation.
Is this enough?
As you guys know,
is this enough, Ed?
Report.
Yeah. Is this enough to get people to buy the iPhone 16 to upgrade from the 15 or the 14 or, like me, the lowly 13?
Joking aside, as I've heard them talk about camera control, it actually sounds like an awesome idea, and I can't wait to get my hands on and test it, but it probably isn't enough. And so you need to separate the hardware story from the software story. And when I say software, I mean AI. And so these are not substantive hardware upgrades from the prior generation iPhone 15, although there is some improvement to the capabilities of the processor in the base 16. What they're talking about in real time, because the event's ongoing, obviously, is why we need Apple Intelligence, their AI suite. in our lives. And very simple summary is that it basically improves the tasks that we already do on our phones each day, makes them more efficient, easier to do, rather than being some kind of wholesale change to how we interact with our mobile phones.
Just very briefly on the camera, Tim, you've met my husband.
Joe.
His name is Joe. He's a
He's a
big
photographer, a real photographer.
Yeah, he actually switched from the Android to the Apple a couple of years ago just because of the camera. But Ed, to your point, I don't know if this is enough. It's very cool, but I don't know if it's enough to sort of pull forward that upgrade cycle. I mean, talk to us a little bit more about the software, though, about Apple Intelligence, because the narrative is out there that Apple is kind of behind where they should be when it comes to AI, and of course this arms race that's underway among all the big tech companies. How far does this event go, if at all, in dispelling that storyline?
Well, the most important piece of news, I suppose, so far is that it will start rolling out in October, which confirms Bloomberg's existing reporting. And so then think about chronology of events. You know, we'll get the full details of the handsets themselves today. They'll start shipping probably by the end of September, and you won't get access to Apple Intelligence until next month. So it's actually a slight delay in terms of like, well, hold on, I just got a new phone, but I don't yet have access to those tools. But the thing I re-emphasize, and I think I just did a post in the blog that they'll put out soon, is that this isn't sort of a new functionality. A lot of what they outlined, be it photo-related or task-related, drafting of an email, reviewing information, it's just a sort of more automated way of doing things we already do, rather than some new brilliant function or task that generative AI has brought us through the handset. But again, Apple being Apple, super heavy emphasis on privacy, data security. That's something they always go back and lean into because they feel they're in a strong position there and they have a great track record.
Maybe that's a good segue to talk about some of the health features that were announced today in Cupertino. Ed,
Sure.
Give us an idea from a health perspective, not just when it comes to sleep apnea, but also what we heard about audio and ear health in the new AirPods lineup.
Yeah, so sleep apnea, starting with Apple Watch Series 10, pending FDA approval, but it's close. A really interesting piece of technology. You know, we don't need to, the three of us, go into our sleeping habits, but sleep apnea is a real thing. You know, many people listening to the program will have loved ones that have some sort of degree of sleep apnea. I know people that have had strokes as a result of sleep apnea. And I can tell you that inside the Steve Jobs Theater, when they confirmed that function, there was real engagement with the audience. This is part of the Apple story about wanting to get into more healthcare services. And very similarly with the current or next generation of AirPods being used as a sort of hearing aid device. You know, they gave the example in the presentation of a woman who was hard of hearing and her son speaking to her at a special event and saying, like, this is why you're so important to us, and using the sort of audio experience of normal hearing versus amplified hearing using the AirPods. New territory in some sense for Apple, but again, confirms Bloomberg Mark Gurman's reporting.
So that's ears. Let's move to the wrist. Let's talk about the watch. The watch is interesting. I mean, some new stuff coming there, especially with sleep apnea. But talk to us a little bit about blood oxygen sensing. This goes back to the beginning of the year, of course, that lawsuit with Massimo. I mean, is there any sense of whether that'll affect users? Are users holding out for that, or is that sort of just indefinitely off the table?
You know, I remember that week well, there was a lot of noise at the time. I don't think there is that much evidence that it sort of puts people off this product and makes them look elsewhere because it's something core to what they want. You know, the sleep apnea detection, along with other monitoring, is a big selling point for the Apple Watch. There's one point that Bloomberg's Ian King and I made in the blog, though, that I would say the health stuff's really important, but you also have to remember what wearables an Apple Watch is. And to all intents and purposes, it's a lower barrier to entry. Think about the price of the Series 10, $399, right? And think about the price of an iPhone handset. We're yet to get the details, I think, for the Pro. If we get it, you'll jump in. But the handset's probably $1,000. So there is a big consumer audience out there that can't afford the smartphone, but maybe they can afford the wearables. Lowers the barrier to entry for the Apple ecosystem. Just fashion. You know, Katie, this one's for you.
Thank you.
It's a piece of jewelry.
Yeah.
And the heavy emphasis on the materials, the partnership with Hermes on the wrist straps. there's an audience for that out there, right?
There definitely is. I have to say, though, Ed, I'm a Garmin gal, and it's going to take a lot to get me away from that brand loyalty. But no, Apple Watches, they're probably, I like this because, you know, it really communicates a piece of my personality. I'm sporty, Tim. I don't know if the Apple Watch does that.
She's wearing Hoka's right now. Also,
under the desk.
That is true. That's not a joke. She actually is.
Yeah.
Ed, before we let you go, a couple questions I have about this. I was able to tune into some of the presentation as I was preparing for this show. All of it that I saw was pre-recorded and very heavily produced. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when very little was pre-produced, and a lot of it had to do with like Tim Cook and Craig Federighi on stage telling you that, you know, U2 was coming to your iPhone. How much of this is pre-produced versus live demos?
Honestly, I think it's really important to say that it's largely all pre-produced. A really interesting question posed in the blog by Ian King was AI used? Because, for example, you know, they have key executives standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and Chrissy Field, the Palace of Fine Arts, like very well-known landmarks.
Where is everybody?
There are no people around them. I mean, these are places that I go almost every day, and I can tell you there's often at least 5 people there, more than 0, you know, if not dozens or hundreds of tourists. So that's kind of interesting. But you are right. I mean, the notable thing is that Apple has a deep bench of talent. You know, there are many product leads and number 2s in the hierarchy that are part of this presentation. And that's become normal in the pandemic and post-pandemic era, for sure.
Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Technology on Bloomberg TV. He's got to get back to that demo happening at the Steve Jobs Theater at Apple Park in Cupertino, California. Ed, thanks so much for joining us with all the updates. Again, we do have a live blog going. Ed's contributing to that. We got a great team contributing to that. Do check that out on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Well, speaking of Apple, it's worth $3.4 trillion. It's more than any other company in the world. 2023 revenue came in at nearly $400 billion. It's about as big as the entire economy of Denmark or the Philippines. Most of the business is about iPhones, but last quarter, Apple's sales just from digital services reached $24.2 billion. It's more than the combined revenue of Adobe, Airbnb, Netflix, Palantir, Spotify, Zoom, and X from Elon Musk. Investors seem to have no problem with this kind of dominance, as Apple's soaring stock price over the past decade makes clear. Regulators, on the other hand, have some questions. It's today's Big Take, written by Austin Carr and Max Chafkin. Austin is a Bloomberg News technology reporter. He joins us from our Boston bureau. Check out their story and more from the Bloomberg Big Take on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Austin, give us an idea of the way that regulators, not just here in the U.S., but around the world, have attempted to take aim at Apple's dominance and also describe that dominance, the so-called Apple tax.
Yeah, so the controversy comes down to how much Apple controls its ecosystem, what they will let into its so-called walled garden, the sort of confines of its platform. And the truth is they don't let a lot in that they don't regulate, review, and also charge certain commissions and fees on, which is what a lot of developers are taking issues with. If you want to see where the market is seeing a little bit of change, it's actually in Europe with the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, with the European Union, has put Apple under some pressure to actually change its ways and open up that walled garden effect. So actually there, you're seeing some pretty novel differences with how you'd have an iPhone in the US. Just for example, they're opening up alternative marketplaces in Europe, so you can actually download a different app store if you want a different set of experience from different software makers like Epic Games or another called AltStore. In fact, over in the EU, you can actually delete Apple native apps. Like soon you'll be able to delete the browser, Safari, the camera app, and even the App Store itself, which is opening up a sort of fundamentally different experience that's a little bit more flexible and open than what we have in the rest of the world. So that's actually a good preview of what you might see on the horizon, depending on how regulation shapes up in the U.S.
And it's interesting because you contrast that with investors. This feels like potentially a case where regulators and investors are at odds here because, I don't know, Austin, do you see any signs that investors are uneasy with just how dominant Apple is?
No, I mean, I think that lock-in effect is actually what ironically makes it so enticing for investors and also such a beloved company for consumers. I mean, look, the tough thing for the DOJ here in the U.S., which filed its antitrust complaint earlier in March, is that what they take issue with, the way that Apple controls its ecosystem and integrates its hardware, software, and services, is usually what consumers really love about it. We like that it works really together if you have a MacBook, an Apple Watch, AirPods, and an iPhone. At the same time, we don't really quite grasp that because of that integrated experience, what it's locking out, it can be a detriment to the experience itself. Even if we like the Apple sort of day-to-day incremental updates. And I think actually today's event with AI, where they didn't really release any new AI features that they hadn't already previewed. They're not actually going to come for a few months. That's one example of the ways that perhaps they're not incentivized to move as fast and as risky and as innovatively as they had to in years past, because there's not a lot of risk that I, as an iPhone user, am going to leave to a different ecosystem.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because we're talking about regulators, then we talked about investors, and you bring up the end user, of course, the customer, the person who is buying into this walled garden. I mean, what is the sense there? Are users getting frustrated with the fact that you do have to buy into an ecosystem? You can't really buy just a product one-off and then integrate it with other products from other companies.
The thing is that this isn't an overnight switch. This is something that they've essentially been building out from when Steve Jobs came back and released the iMac, then the iPod, and so on. You started building up that ecosystem over the course of decades, where if you have an iPhone, remember that device came out before there was an App Store. And then they introduced the App Store a year later. Then they introduced a lot of companion devices like the iPad, like the Apple Watch, like AirPods. And then on top of that, part of what makes CEO Tim Cook's era so monumental has been this push into services. So you subscribe to iCloud, you subscribe to TV Plus, fitness, subscriptions, things like that. And so these are all things that add on to the experience and make it just that much easier to add a new Apple device or a new Apple subscription, because that's your default. That's what you're going to want to add to. Now, that also makes it easier to escape that ecosystem. Once you've invested thousands of dollars in the Apple ecosystem, you're not going to suddenly overnight switch to a Windows PC or a Google Pixel phone just because they add a new AI feature. It makes that sort of moat that Apple has all the wider, because it is very difficult to people not just to switch one device, but to switch their entire portfolio of hardware and software. And I think that's why shareholders really love Apple stock, because its moat is so wide. Its walled garden barriers are so tall.
Austin, you and Max, I love the way you start the piece, that iconic 1984 Apple ad, the sort of David versus Goliath, and where Apple has come since then, and from then. I wonder, just in the last 30 seconds that we have with you, what the biggest threat to Apple is right now moving forward.
I mean, I think it is sort of a feeling of incrementalism, of, things aren't seemingly disruptive until they are, or being able to disrupt until they are disrupted. I think when ChatGPT came along in late 2022, that shocked a lot of people. No one had ever seen anything like that. And here we are 2 years later, and Apple's just getting around to rolling out its AI features, many of which won't roll out to 2025. Now, did that disrupt, sales of the iPhone going forward? No, there's not really a ChatGPT phone that's out there. But you can see the risks of sort of slowly introducing some of this innovation. It has downsides for consumers. At what point are they going to say, you know what, I want something a little bit sooner, I want something a little bit faster and cooler?
Austin Carr, one half of the team that did today's Bloomberg Big Take. Check it out at Bloomberg.com/The Big Take, and of course on the terminal. Up next, David Gura joins us following his one-on-one with Treasury Secretary Jenny Yellen.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg on a day when stocks are ripping higher. Apple is a notable exception. We've got Apple shares trading lower right now. Apple down by 1.4%, but the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. Apple introducing the latest version of its flagship product, the iPhone 16, with CEO Tim Cook saying it's designed to take advantage of artificial intelligence from the ground up. The iPhone 16 and 16 Plus will be available in new colors. Stay with Bloomberg Radio and Television for the latest developments out of Cupertino. But again, key takeaway here, we've got Apple shares moving lower. Apple down now by 1.4%. Stocks are advancing with the S&P off session highs up 49 now, a gain of 0.9%. Dow Jones Industrial Average climbing higher by 452 points, up 1.1%, and NASDAQ is up by 0.7%. 10-year at 3.70%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.66%. Gold up 0.2%, 25.01 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.6%, 68.74 a barrel. After the close of trading today, we'll be hearing from Oracle. Oracle ahead of earnings down by 0.5%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks for that, Charlie. Do appreciate that Bloomberg Business Flash. Well, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said there are no, quote, red lights flashing for the financial system. She also reiterated her view that the U.S. economy has reached a soft landing, even as job growth weakens. Yellen spoke in a fireside conversation with Bloomberg's David Gura at the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin, Texas on Saturday. Here's part of what she had to say when David asked her if there are pockets or risks in the global financial system that are especially worrisome to her.
Overall, I would say for the U.S., the kinds of metrics that we would monitor that would summarize risks, whether it's asset valuations or the degree of leverage, things look good. There are not, I don't see red lights flashing.
That's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking to David Gura on Saturday. David is a Bloomberg News correspondent and host of the Big Take podcast. He joins us now in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. David, you had a good bit of time with the Treasury Secretary, an hour-long conversation. Just talk to us a little bit about how you approached it and what you were hoping to get out of this conversation with her.
Yeah, I knew that this was going to be a substantial amount of time, and she'll come on Bloomberg and rival TV networks from time to time to talk for, 10, 15 minutes. So I thought this would be an opportunity to go a bit deeper, not just about the news of the day and her perspective on the economy, but how she got to where she got, both in terms of her intellectual evolution, her evolution as a policymaker, but also professionally. I mean, she has had some of the biggest jobs in government, and nobody's had the trifecta that she's had of being both, all three, economic advisor to President Clinton, vice chair and chair of the Federal Reserve, and now Treasury Secretary. So a fascinating career trajectory, and we spent a lot of time kind of talking about each of those points in her life and also what she's learned about economics along the way.
And I assume you also talked about what's next, because I mean, with a resume like that, I mean, where could you possibly go from here?
I think that the University of California, Berkeley would be happy to have her back teaching on its faculty. That's where she was till about 2.5 decades ago. And her husband, of course, the Nobel laureate, George Shakerloff as well. So I think that could be in the cards. I asked her explicitly, I said, is there a world in which, come January, you, if Vice President Harris is elected, would stay on in the job? And she didn't close the door on that completely. She didn't leave it wide open, I should say. But again, she's had such a long career in public service. It seemed like it was something that she didn't want to foreclose automatically.
All right, well, before we get there, there's certainly a lot on her plate and a lot on her agenda right now with where the economy is and where she sees it going. I mentioned this part that she saw no red lights flashing. What did she say about if or whether we have achieved a soft landing, or Fed Chair Jay Powell has achieved a soft landing here in the U.S.?
Yeah, she has maintained for a long time that we're on the trajectory to get there, and this was as close as I've heard her come to saying that we are in fact there. So I spent 2 days in Austin and saw her on each of those days. The first day was at an IRS processing facility where a lot of forms are filed and dealt with, and we saw all of that. It was kind of cool to see all these machines and people going through.
Yeah. It's where people send
Yeah, and so now, a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act is to modernize that, to make the IRS more efficient. And so what she was given demonstrations of were mail sorting machines, and she jokingly asked if they still retained her tax returns from 1971, and they said, no, they don't. But a lot of that is being digitized now. After that tour, we got the jobs numbers, and I asked her sort of where she thinks we are, because if you look at the trend, certainly, if you look at the last 3 months on average, it's a much lower number than we saw at the beginning of this year. She's a labor economist by training. This is something that preoccupies her. She thinks a lot about, and she didn't say explicitly that that's a worrisome trend, but she acknowledged it. But all the while, she said, that's where you want jobs numbers to be. Like historically, if we were getting 140,000 jobs a month, that would be great. So she is optimistic in that regard that the Fed has managed to do this, get inflation largely under control, not to the 2% target that she really fought for and worked on making the official target when she was at the Fed, and the job market to maintain a relative healthiness as she sees it all the while.
You also spent a good chunk of time talking about China and Janet Yellen. I mean, that's kind of been one of her signatures over, several jobs the past several decades. Of course, she spent a lot of time in China too. Does she have another China trip in the cards?
I asked her that. I mean, so we got a few months left here till the end of the Biden administration, and she took a trip over there around the time that the state Secretary of State was there, Commerce Secretary, and she had a really effective visit. I mean, you'll recall that when Antony Blinken first went over there were all these days went by when he's waiting. Is he going to get a meeting with the president or not? She had these meetings. They were long meetings, and something I said to her was, you go to China and people are willing to hear you out. You're bringing difficult news, tough talk, and all the while, people are listening to you. They're taking you at faith and engaging with you. She said that she'd be open to taking another trip there. She'd like to see her counterpart come to the United States, so that's certainly in the cards. But you mentioned her success with China. I think that something that fascinates me about her, and something we got into a little bit, is just the evolution of her as a policymaker. I mentioned, as an academician, she's a labor economist, but she's taken on these jobs that required learning whole new skills. And, from day one, almost, at the Treasury Department, she was trying to cobble together this international agreement on corporate taxation. That required a ton of diplomacy. She did that with aplomb. We saw Russia invade Ukraine, same thing, marshaled the allies really quickly to get them to impose sanctions on Russia. China's another example of that. Again, very skillfully, she has dealt with a country that I think we once saw as more of an ally than a rival, now is in that new camp, and she's really not only embraced the role of dealing with them in that way, but kind of set the parameters or contours of what that relationship looks like.
How political did she get? How political did the conversation get? Was it more academic, less political? I mean, here we are. You're going to the debate tomorrow. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But, I mean, these campaigns are in the final stretch.
So I knew that she'd be studiously apolitical. Like, I couldn't say, what do you think about Vice President Harris's plans, for instance? So I tried to ask her about some of the things that we're hearing talked about on the campaign trail and see what she would say. So, for instance, I asked her about price gouging, something that Vice President Harris has made kind of a key part of her economic policy platform, suggesting that there could be more done to enforce that or crack down on companies. I knew that previously Janet Yellen had said that it was supply and demand that has created the high inflation that we have, not companies. So we dealt with issues like that. We talked about tariffs. She is not a political person. As I was kind of getting ready for the interview, I looked back on the forms that she had to fill out when she was nominated, and one of them is name every office that you've held or public office where you've been voted to a position going back to the age of 18. She wrote none. So I think she recognizes the fact that in this job, she's a key part of an administration, but she still sees herself as more technocratic and not political. That's tricky, but she is like she's a person who will cite the Hatch Act more than anyone else. She doesn't want to opine her way in on politics. She's very careful about that. But certainly she's talking the book of what the Biden administration has done so far and what they hope to achieve here in these last few months.
And sort of transitioning slowly into politics, she also said that deficits need to be brought down. You think about the policy positions that we've heard from both candidates at this point. It doesn't seem like that's in either of their plans.
No, and so, I knew I wanted to ask her about that. And again, going back and doing research to when that confirmation hearing took place, she said that it's incumbent upon a Treasury Secretary to look for fiscal sanity and advocate for fiscal sanity. At that same hearing, which was, of course, in this crucible of a lot of difficulty with the pandemic, she was simultaneously urging Congress to go big. So, again, as I looked at the long arc of her career, she had a reputation for being a real deficit hawk for a long time. Obviously, that changed given the circumstances. And I asked her, is now the time for kind of a fiscal reset? Given what we're seeing in the economy, how things have normalized some, I think that she would like to see that. I think that she's not as worried about some of the projections that we've seen from the Congressional Budget Office about the size of deficits relative to GDP, but acknowledges that those figures look scary and could be an issue going forward. So I think that she's getting to the point where she's once again comfortable to say, look, we're out of the woods, almost out of the woods when it comes to the effects of the pandemic, and it's time to start talking about this more seriously again.
Speaking of talking about it seriously, you're headed to debate after work today. I'm guessing you're jumping on a train and headed to Philadelphia.
I am.
From Texas to Philly, with a stop in New York City in between.
Tried for the direct flight.
Do you think
it's too hard?
Yeah, good luck. Do you think the deficit will come up in the debate tomorrow at all?
I think that it might. I think that there are a handful of economic watchwords that these candidates like to throw out there, just candidates generally like to throw out there. I think that people who are expecting real specificity about tax proposals or what they might do with the deficit, that's unlikely to come up, I think, during the course of this. But I think that it's something that we've heard President Trump bring up. We've heard Vice President Harris bring up as well. I think that it's something that we're likely to hear about, probably in a non-concrete way. I do think that both of them recognize the fact that this is the driving issue for voters in this campaign. That's the economy. And I think they're going to want to try to differentiate themselves from each other over the course of the debate. How specific they get, I think, is anyone's guess.
So there's substance, but there's also the fact that, I mean, this could be the only debate that we see. You made the point to me earlier, actually, that they haven't been in the same room together before, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Correct.
So, I mean, how personal could this get?
Very. I think it's, suffice that, it could be very personal. And you're right. I mean, there was this moment when Donald Trump was kind of floating 3 or 4 different debates, making it seem like the Harris campaign had agreed to them. They hadn't. So right now, this is all that's on the calendar. And what we know of the prep process that the vice president's been going through over the last 5 days is it's very traditional. She's holed up in a hotel in Pittsburgh with her staff, thinking through what Donald Trump might say, how she might respond to it, how she might kind of poke and prod him to say things that might be advantageous for her. We have these kind of mock debates that we're familiar with from past campaigns where, Philippe Reines, who was a big Hillary Clinton advisor and famously played Trump during her debate prep, is playing Trump once again in the debate prep this time around. So, I think that she is taking a characteristic for her tack in doing this, which is to prep pretty hard, go through a lot of material and kind of go through what all the contingencies might be, seeing what happens on stage.
It also comes at a time, David, where we got this new poll from the New York Times Siena College over the weekend that showed, I don't want to say a pullback in the Harris bounce, but less enthusiasm for her and more for Trump than their same poll a few weeks ago. Sort of explain the background here.
Yeah, so I think that the fear in the Harris camp is that there's a stalling out of support for her. And, this is such a novel, unprecedented moment where you have a candidate dropping out and Harris coming in. And we saw enthusiasm from the get-go, and that carried through the convention. So there wasn't this traditional convention bounce that a lot of candidates have seen in the past. All the while, there was talk about when this stall out might happen, if it would happen. So I think there's cause for concern, but the tack that the campaign is taking is very much, we're the underdog here. We're investing heavily in ads, both TV and digital, and we're not treating this as though it's a done deal. And it's going to be very hard fought. It's going to be a very close campaign, we know, from now until the election.
What time is the debate? 9 p.m.?
9 p.m. Eastern time.
You'll have to tell me about it the next time. I'm
you'll be asleep.
By then. Yeah.
Look in your email box. I'll send you a personal digest.
There we go.
Well, a big thank you to Bloomberg News correspondent, also host of the Big Take podcast, David Gura. Check out all the coverage from his interview on Saturday. You can do that at Bloomberg.com and, of course, always on the Bloomberg terminal. Taking a look at where equities are, we're off our best levels of the day, but still up close to 1% on the S&P 500. NASDAQ Composite up by 0.7%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up by 1.1%. Coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, we're talking real estate with Barbara Fox. That's next.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We're off session highs, but still the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. 42-point gain right now on the S&P. Back at 54.50, a gain of 0.8%. Dow Industrials up 396 now, up by 1%. NASDAQ up 91 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, higher now by 0.5%. 10-year 3.70% with a 2-year that's yielding 3.67%. Gold up $5.50 the ounce to $25.02, up by about 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.5%, $68.68 a barrel on WTI. All major groups in the S&P 500 index are advancing. One notable exception today, Apple, as it unveils new products, product enhancements. We got Apple shares down by 1.6%. GSK's experimental drug helped prevent serious asthma attacks in 2 late-stage studies, easing the path forward for a medicine that the British company says could reach $3.9 billion in annual sales. ADRs of GSK up today by about 0.4%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P now higher by 44 points, up 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, home sales in Manhattan rose for the first time in 2 years. This was in the second quarter of the year. This as impatient buyers who'd been waiting for interest rates to fall took the plunge. Closings of co-ops and condos spiked 12.2% in Manhattan in the 3 months through June from the same period in 2023. That's according to appraiser Miller Samuel and brokerage Douglas Elliman Real Estate. The median price of $1.18 million in the quarter dipped slightly from a year earlier, still though hovering near a record since rates soared back in mid-2022. For an update on how things look in this quarter and forward, we turn to Barbara Fox. She's president of Fox Residential Group. It's a brokerage firm that works with buyers and sellers throughout New York City, and that is where this afternoon we find Barbara. Barbara, how would you describe where we are in the third quarter of the year now that we're in the final month of the quarter?
Well, it's an interesting market, and we can rest assured of one thing: our market never is static. We came off of a very slow summer, very little activity, and it didn't really change prices very much, but we're now into a little bit more of an active, frisky market, one that we haven't seen in a while.
A frisky market, a frisky New York real estate market. I mean, what does that mean in terms of prices? And I mean, actually zooming back from that even, what do you attribute that to? Because, of course, rates have come down, mortgage rates, but not by that much.
They haven't, and we're not going to see the mortgage rates we saw before ever again, and I think people are getting more used to that. You know, everything becomes a new normal in New York. What's happening right now is that there is very little product on the market. There's a real shortage of product. There are a lot of apartments on the market and properties, but there's a shortage of compared to other periods of time. But prices have never been higher than they are right now. So you have sort of this juxtaposition of two things that don't necessarily jive. What we really are seeing is, with this increase in activity that's come up in the last couple weeks, and this actually started before Labor Day, I think people are realizing that everybody, you know, there's a market, always an active market in New York. It's just the degree of activity. So people are thinking that, you know, it's time to start looking again, because once more product comes on the market and more people come into the market, the prices, it will push the prices even higher. So buyers are still looking for good buys, which they can still get. And it's just interest rates probably aren't going to go down too much more than they have already. I think they averaged about 6.35% over in the last 18 months or so. I'm not sure, something like that. And I don't think we're gonna see interest rates much below 6%. So people are getting used to these new numbers. People still need to buy things. They need to buy homes. And I really think that the buyer demand is going to pick up as long as interest rates don't go back up.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, 6% is still so high. It's not 4%, but
Historically,
it's certainly better than 8%.
Yeah, and better than where things were in the 1980s. That's what Carol always reminds me.
Yeah, I was in the business in the I was in the business in the 80s, and we had 18% interest rates at one point. Yeah, I know it's crazy.
I cannot
imagine. And then they went down to 2 and 3%. So go figure. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the price dynamics a little bit. I'm looking at some of the listings that you have, the sales you're currently representing, some pretty big price tags, multi-million dollars there. I mean, are we seeing big markdowns? I mean, maybe these buyers are getting used to, interest rates where they are, but how are we seeing that translate into the prices that sellers can ask for?
When you're in a market which is very volatile, as we are seeing now, and I think this volatility will pretty much remain until after the election. I mean, we have so much bad stuff going on all over the world right now. It's going to be volatile for a while. And sellers need to understand that even though their prices even though they price their units at a certain point, and hopefully they've gotten some good advice from brokers, it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a buyer to buy it at that price point. So sellers really need to be less rigid in their expectation of sale prices in this kind of volatile market. I think particularly in New York, finding the right buyer and the right timing is a little more important even than finding the right price. And prices are always negotiable. So,
Barbara, over the last few years, when we've spoken to you and we've spoken to folks in New York City who are in the real estate industry, we've seen different themes emerge. Early on in the pandemic, it was people leaving the city, and then a little later, it was people coming back to the city. We saw an explosion of all-cash deals when rates went higher initially. What's the pattern and the theme that you're seeing right now? When people who are moving to the city or moving within the city, why are they moving, and how are they buying, and where are they going?
Well, I don't think there's any great desire to move out of the city right now. We're not seeing a lot of that, which is why the supply of apartments and properties in New York and Manhattan are so low. There's not a lot of people moving. There are not a lot of people moving for a lot of reasons, but for one reason is a lot of people are sitting with these fixed 2 and 3 and 4% interest rates, and they don't want to have to redo those into a 6 or 7% interest rate. So they're not moving for that reason. And just generally, I don't think that there is there's no desire to escape the city anymore. And that was very prevalent after COVID and during COVID. But I think a lot of people have moved back to the city and are happily ensconced here, and that's great. And everything that's great about the city remains really great, and it's very buoyant right now.
Barbara, we're going to have to leave it there. Do appreciate you taking the time. Always good to check in with you. Barbara Fox is president of Fox Residential Group. It's a brokerage firm that works with buyers and sellers throughout New York City. That's where Barbara joined us from this afternoon. Hey, Katie, take a look at the markets right now. I'm looking at shares of Apple specifically down 1.4% on the day that Apple unveiled those new iPhone 16, the new lineup of AirPods, and of course the new Apple Watch that I don't know if you're going to get at this point.
I don't think I'm going to. I have my loyalties. I'm a Garmin gal. Anyway, you take a look at not only the single stock level, but the index level as well is very interesting because we're off of session highs. The S&P 500, the NASDAQ 100, but still a meaningful rally. And you think about how bad last week was, some of the superlatives. I mean, the S&P 500 worst week since March 2023, the NASDAQ 100 worst week since November 2022.
The stocks, the worst week since 2020?
I mean, it just keeps going. Yeah. So a little bit of a relief rally today. We'll see how sustainable.
Hey, coming up next, we're talking about one of those stocks that is moving higher, Boeing. That's next on Bloomberg Business Week.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. That is Katie Greifeld in for Carol Masser from Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg News. I'm Tim Stenivek. We're here in our Bloomberg Business Week studio. Boeing shares up 3.7%. They're rallying on optimism that a labor deal with its largest union will help the troubled U.S. aircraft manufacturer avoid a potentially crippling strike at its Seattle area factories. We got with us George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst. He joins us from BI headquarters out there in Princeton, New Jersey. It's a landmark deal. It was hammered out over the weekend, a 25% wage increase over 4 years, and also, George, a commitment to build Boeing's next plane in the Seattle area. This is according to each side in separate statements. What was at stake here, and what do we know about the deal?
Yeah, so a lot was at stake. I think the biggest thing at stake was Boeing's second half recovery, right? Boeing's burned a lot of cash in the first half of this year, over $9 billion. Cash balance is down about 11 when we close the half. We think they need about $9-ish billion to run the business. So they can't withstand a lot more quarters of cash burn like that and not have to go back to capital markets and raise more money. I think they'd prefer not to, right? They'd prefer not to either dilute the equity with an equity offering or pressure the credit rating with more debt. So this deal lets them get back to focusing on building airplanes. Now, I should say the deal isn't necessarily done, right? The rank and file have to agree to this deal. They vote, I think, Thursday is what I'm hearing. We are hearing some grumblings.
Right.
They didn't hit the 40% level. They came in asking for a 40% pay increase. But 25 seems like a good number, seems like a fair number. I think labor has maybe not as strong its bargaining position as it was perhaps last year. But the company definitely needs to get these, the workers, keep them coming to work and building airplanes and getting them shipped.
Yeah, it's a good point, too, that this isn't a done deal. 25% is not 40%, so we'll see if this gets through the rank and file, as you say. Also part of this was the fact that they're going to start building in Seattle again. What is the significance of that, George?
Well, so the agreement says that if they launch the next airplane during the 4 years of this contract, they're committing to building it in the Puget Sound region, right? And so, obviously, if you're the machinist union from the region, that makes you pretty happy. That gives the workers, longevity because, I think the next airplane that Boeing would build would be a replacement for the 737. I think, its airframe is probably really due for a revamp, and that's going to be the moneymaker and the volume leader. And so if you're the union, that's longevity for the union too, right? You want to have an important place building that program. You don't want it to get sort of pulled away like the 787 did into the Carolinas.
Hey, well, talk a little bit about that because my understanding, George, is that the reason the 787 is built in the Carolinas is because of a different union, a lack of a union or organized labor in that part of the country.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the reasons Boeing, initially what Boeing did too is they divided, 787 builds. They built them in Washington area, Washington State, and they built them in the Carolinas. And I think there was a lot of commonality between the two lines so they could do some, they could transfer knowledge to the Carolinas with the existing workforce up in the Washington area. I think Boeing, had a pretty heavy interest in trying to get away from union areas, away from the machinists so they could have perhaps easier labor relations. I think it would be harder to do with such a high volume program like the 737, although they would probably be very smart to diversify. Airbus has a number of different final assembly facilities for the A320 around the world even. And so when there's a problem in any singular region, they don't have, sort of production really significantly impacted, where Boeing, if there's a problem up in Renton, Washington, it's going to be really hard to deliver 737. So I think it's a worthy goal, but in this case, Boeing was not in a very good position to negotiate. And I think the labor unions got a nice piece of the contract there, a nice agreement there.
Okay, George, we only have less than a minute left with you, but I want to end on a curveball. I want to talk about space, because you mentioned that Boeing doesn't want to have many more quarters of the cash burn that we've seen. Is Kelly Ortberg going to pull the plug on the space part of the business?
You know, I've heard a lot of people talk about this, but I guess what I would leave you with is, you know, the government, U.S. government, NASA contracted Boeing for a lot of money to build capability for a capsule. And so this particular capsule's had problems, but they want redundancy. And so I think they have to claw back the development money and give it to somebody else if Boeing wanted out. Plus, I think it's just a function of Boeing needs to get back to its roots of solid engineering and manufacturing. And I think walking away from businesses isn't the right way to do it. I think they want to stay involved in space.
George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst, joins us from Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters out there in Princeton, New Jersey. That's going to do it for our TV hour here on Bloomberg Business Week. But if you're sticking with us on YouTube or Bloomberg Originals and Bloomberg Radio, we got a great program coming up. We're talking Google, Starbucks. We got the CEO of SecureWorks with us and more. If you're sticking on TV, the close comes up next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week, live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York. Streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Tim Stenevec, along with Katie Greifeld from Bloomberg News and Bloomberg TV, in for Carol Masser once again. And tomorrow, too, Katie,
Yes,
is that right?
yes. It'll be insane.
Insane. On the day of the debate.
I know. I'm excited. Again, going to preview it hard. It's at 9 p.m.
Yeah. It's like
I
past
wake
my
up
bedtime.
at like 5 a.m. every morning, so I don't know if that's going to happen.
You're away. You'll watch some of it, right?
No.
Okay.
No, I told you I've been taking magnesium. I've been getting to bed on time. I've been
Good.
doing well. So.
How's your sleep score?
It was an 87 last night.
That's
out of
pretty
100.
good.
It is pretty
That's
good.
very good.
Yeah, I'm thrilled with it.
Yeah, I think I was at 70, so
Okay.
it's not so good.
Not so good.
Yeah, but I beat you at the quiz earlier this week, or
That's
last
enough.
week. So
That was last week. We're
Yeah.
talking about this week.
All right. Well, speaking of this week, it's day one for Starbucks CEO Brian Niccol, who heads to Seattle to head up the world's largest coffee chain. We're going to check in with our consumer reporter who's been following that story. Also, what's going on over at Google? The ad empire is under fire with the U.S. antitrust trial to begin. We also got later joining us Wendy Thomas, the CEO over at SecureWorks, giving us the latest after last week's earnings report that sent the stock higher and led to an upgrade as well. All that and more over the next 2 hours on Bloomberg Business Week. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Hey, thank you very much. Here we are, final hour of trading Monday, and we have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ very much in the green. Wakey to both of you. The S&P right now, up 47, gain there of 0.9%. The Dow, 420 right now, higher by 420 points, up by 1%. And we've got NASDAQ up 105 right now, a gain there of just about 0.6%. Russell 2000 index also moving higher, up by about 0.4%. 10-year yield 3.69% with a 2-year 3.66%. Spot gold up $6 the ounce, 25.03, edging higher by 0.2%. A big move in West Texas. Intermediate crude today up 1.6%, still below 70, 68.76 on WTI. After the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Oracle, and Oracle shares ahead of earnings, down now by about 0.3%. Nvidia, Tesla, they are among the mega caps that are leading gains right now. We've got shares of Tesla up by 2.6%, Nvidia up now by about 2.3%. So, stocks higher. What about the market backdrop? Marianne Bartels is Chief Investment Strategist at Sanctuary Securities.
The indicators suggest that if we have 1 or 2 days of really big chop, we're going to really start getting some great buy signals. So I think we're pretty close, which means none of us can really time the markets exactly when they bottom. But now would be, if you were looking to buy the markets, we think this is a good time to actually be nibbling in the markets, because we do believe we're going to continue to get a year-end rally.
Marianne Bartels of Sanctuary Securities. S&P again up 48, higher now by 0.9%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. Google is heading back to court today to face U.S. Justice Department allegations that it manipulates the $677 billion display advertising market in violation of antitrust laws, just 1 month after losing a landmark ruling that it illegally dominates online search. Let's get the latest from Sarah Forden, Bloomberg News legal team reporter, joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Sarah, help us understand what this issue is all about, given that the company just lost this landmark ruling that it illegally dominates online search. What's at issue here?
Hi, yeah, this is about the tools that serve the display ad market business. So these are advertisements that appear on websites, on publishers' websites. And the DOJ is arguing